Chapter 1. Eli sat down at his table and rested his face in his hands. He'd finally been able to hire 4 new men to work the extra cattle. He had never thought he'd get to the point where he wouldn't have to do all the work himself, but the fall sale had been in his favor. He sighed, looking around his filthy house. He needed to hire someone to take care of the house, too. He'd neglected so much in the past 6 years while he'd built up his ranch. His eyes caught a stray piece of paper tucked into his Bible. He walked across the room and pulled it out, his eyes scanning the words. How had he forgotten? 6 years before, he'd sent off a letter to an agency that matched mail-order brides with Western men. Before a woman could be placed with him, he'd had an offer from a neighbor to buy his spread. He couldn't resist for what the man was asking, but it had wiped him out financially. He'd worked 16-hour days for 6 years. Knowing the work he had ahead of him, he'd send off a second letter saying he had a change of fortune, and he'd send a letter when he was ready to marry. He was in the black for the first time in 6 years. Eli was as ready as he'd ever be. He took paper and a pen and quickly wrote a letter before he lost his nerve. Dear Elizabeth Miller, thank you for giving me extra time to be ready to find myself a bride. I'm not sure if you remember the letter I sent you more than 6 years ago. My name is Eli King, and I'm a rancher in Montana, not far outside of Billings. I would like a bride. I'm not picky about how she looks, but I'd like someone who is reasonably intelligent and loves others more than she loves herself. Do you have anyone like that you could send me? Sincerely, Eli King. He threw the letter to a corner of the table, knowing he'd take it to town when he went for supplies the following day. There. Now he wouldn't have to worry about finding a housekeeper. A bride was just as good. Right? Elizabeth frowned down at the letter in her hand. She'd never gotten one asking for specific character attributes in all the years she'd been a matchmaker. It was so much easier to find a bride with blonde hair and blue eyes than one who thought of others before herself. She wasn't sure how to handle him. She sat down at her writing desk and did the only thing she knew to do. Dear Harriet, enclosed you will find a letter from a Montana rancher seeking a wife. I placed a bride with a friend of his years ago, and I'm not certain how to proceed here with his requests for specific character traits. Do you have any suggestions on how I can go about discovering these things, beyond the initial interview? Yours, Elizabeth. Elizabeth hated admitting she still needed help after all these years, but sometimes Harriet was just able to figure things out easier than she was, and she called on her whenever she needed to. She hoped Harriet would have some ideas. Harriet opened the letter that was lying on her desk when she got home from her walk with the children in the park. 4 children in 6 years had kept her busy, but she still missed her business. Maybe Elizabeth would have a question only she could answer. She let out a half laugh. Elizabeth had been doing the job longer than she had ever done it at this point. She rarely wrote for advice. These days she wrote just to keep her up on how everything was going back in Beckham. Harriet smiled when she read the letter. A difficult one. She read the man's letter and thought carefully. Her niece, Daisy, had come to her just the day before asking to be matched to someone. She had no prospects, because she was so shy, and she wanted to get her mother off her back about marriage. Daisy would be the perfect woman for Eli. She sat back in her chair for a moment, thinking about how her sister-in-law would react if she sent her baby off to Montana. She scrawled a note to Daisy to come see her. If Mary didn't like it, then she'd find out soon enough. She wanted her daughters happily married, didn't she? Daisy walked along the peaceful streets of Seattle to her Aunt Harriet's house. She knew the summons was probably about her request to be placed somewhere as a bride, so she wouldn't have to deal with finding her own husband. She was in no hurry to marry, but she had to do something to get her mother to leave her alone. She definitely wasn't opposed to marriage, and realized it was probably time for her, but she had never met a man who made her feel like her sisters felt about their husbands. Her aunt had said it would take a week before she'd have someone for Daisy, but obviously she'd worked faster than expected. Daisy knocked on the door and waited for one of the maids to open it for her. Her Aunt Harriet was in her parlor waiting for her, as usual. Daisy hurried to the parlor to find her aunt sitting at her desk writing a letter. She was rubbing her leg in that absent way that told everyone else that her old injury was bothering her again. As Daisy sat in the chair opposite her, Harriett looked up to notice she was there for the first time. "Daisy. Thanks for coming." There was genuine pleasure to see her on her aunt's face. Daisy nodded. "Did you go to the park this morning?" Daisy knew her aunt did her best to take advantage of every pretty day and go to the park if at all possible. Harriett grinned. The weather was too fine not to. In another year Simon will be off to school, and there won't be a lot of park days any longer. She sighed, obviously not liking the idea of her children heading off to school. Daisy smiled. "I think Mother rejoiced each time one of us started school and the house got just a little bit quieter." Harriett laughed. "Well, your mother had 8, and I only have 4. Harriet's face grew serious as she pulled a letter from her desk. "Read this." Daisy frowned as she opened the letter. Why didn't her aunt just tell her what was going on? As she read, her eyes grew wide. "Are you suggesting that I marry this man?" Harriett nodded. "I think you'd be perfect for Eli. You're a good cook, thanks to your years volunteering at the battered women's house. You know how to sew and clean. You're extremely intelligent and always think of others before yourself. What do you think?" Daisy shook her head slowly, not disagreeing, but disbelieving. "Mama would kill me if I moved away from Seattle." Harriett laughed. "She can't keep all her daughters as close as she's kept the first 3. I'll send Higgins out to investigate, of course, but I think you should respond." She pushed a piece of paper and a pen at Daisy. Daisy grinned. "I think I will." She dipped the pen into the inkwell sitting in front of her and quickly wrote out a letter. She had no idea what would happen, but she needed adventure. She needed to get out of Seattle and begin her own life. What better way than to marry a rancher she'd never met? Daisy didn't say anything to her mother in the weeks that passed. She wasn't sure what to expect when she got a response, but she liked the idea of going somewhere and starting anew. Somewhere she wouldn't be just one of the banker's flower kids. She loved her name and her sisters, well, most of them, but she hated that she was never anyone in her own right. She'd meet someone and they'd laugh and say, "So which flower are you?" She never got to be just Daisy Sullivan. It was 3 weeks to the day later when she got another summons from Aunt Harriet. She read the note sent over with one of her aunt's maids quickly. "Daisy, I have some information for you. Please come over for tea this afternoon. Around 1. Aunt Harriet." Daisy grinned. Finally an answer. She went into the parlor where her mother was sitting darning socks. Iris goes through socks like other women go through hair bows. How does she ruin them all? Mary had a look on her face that made it obvious that her youngest daughter drove her mad at times. Daisy shrugged. "I have no idea. It may be that she keeps running outside with no shoes on, but doesn't take her socks off?" Mary shook her head. "Why does she do that?" "I don't know. Because she's Iris? I suppose that's as logical as any other reason." Mary sighed heavily. "She's not going to go through as many socks when she has to darn them herself." Mary spotted the note in Daisy's hand. "What's that?" Daisy held it up. "Oh, it's just a note from Aunt Harriet inviting me to tea. She wants me there in an hour, and I thought I'd start walking now. Maybe find a couple of new ribbons to match my new dress." Mary nodded. "That's fine. Have a good time." Daisy waved and pulled on her jacket. It was a chilly day, but thankfully, there was no rain. The worst thing about Seattle was all the rain. She wondered what Montana would be like. She stopped at the general store and bought the ribbons like she'd told her mother she would. She hated to lie, even if it was something so little, so she made sure that what she did matched what she'd said she'd do. Daisy made the short walk through town happily, stopping to look at her sister Amaryllis's house. She'd have stopped to say hello, but she knew Riley would be at the library working. The house looked pretty, though, and made Daisy feel closer to her sister. She rushed on past and finally reached Aunt Harriet's door. She knew she was early, but she couldn't wait to find out what her aunt had to say. When she took her seat across from Harriet, her aunt's eyes were lit up with excitement. Higgins just got back to town. And? Harriet smiled, her face almost glowing. He's perfect for you. He's known to be a loving gentleman. No one had a word to say against him. He's polite and kind. A good employer. A hard worker. I think we found you a husband. Daisy sat up straight and squealed. She'd been certain Higgins would find something wrong with the man. Seriously? Did we get a response to my letter? Just got it yesterday. I didn't want you to read it until I was sure he was a good man, though. Harriet pushed the letter across her desk to Daisy. I didn't read it, of course. Daisy unfolded the single sheet and read through the letter. Dear Daisy, you sound like the bride I'm looking for. Ticket is enclosed. I'll pick you up in Billings on the 5th of January. Thought you might want to spend Christmas with your family before making the trip. I can't wait to meet you. We'll marry before we leave town. Yours, Eli. 3 weeks. I'll meet my husband in 3 weeks. Daisy jumped up from her chair and hugged Harriet. How am I going to tell Mama? She asked, frowning when she knew she should be happy. Harriet sighed. I'll help you. She can be angry with us both. And Higgins. I'll make him come along too. Harriet grinned evilly. Daisy giggled. When will we tell her? Harriet thought about it for a moment. Let's tell her after dinner on Christmas Day. We're all going to your house this year. Daisy knew that the all meant her Aunt Harriet and her family, as well as her sisters and their families, and Higgins and his wife. Sounds good. Mama's going to kill us all. Harriet smiled. It's going to be fine. She'll just be pleased that Eli has Higgins's approval. Everyone trusts Higgins. Daisy went home and immediately started going through her clothes, trying to decide what she wanted to take with her. Everything wouldn't be suitable. She would need to leave the town dresses for her younger sisters to grow into. Later in the day, she made a quick trip to the dressmaker, asking her to make some plain work dresses for her. At the older woman's frown, she simply shrugged. I need to have some simple dresses just like every other woman, don't I? Her order was for 6 work dresses. That should be enough for her. She had her church dresses that she would take with her for Sundays. Daisy rushed to prepare in the days leading up to Christmas, not letting her mother know what she was doing. She didn't tell anyone, not even Amaryllis, though she knew she would before it was time for her to leave. After Christmas dinner, her aunt gave her several looks that meant, it's time to tell your parents, but she ignored them all. Finally Harriet stood. Fred and Mary, Daisy and I need to talk to you in your study. Higgins? Would you mind joining us? Higgins had been Harriet's butler and father figure for years. His stepson had married Amaryllis. He spent every holiday with the Sullivan family, and Daisy felt he was as much of an uncle as her Uncle Max was. She stood and followed Harriet into the study, taking a seat on the couch. She didn't want to have to be the one to tell her parents what she was planning. She hoped Aunt Harriet planned on doing all the talking for her. Fred sat in the chair behind his desk, and Mary sat across from him. Higgins took an armchair perpendicular to the blue sofa that Daisy had sat on, and Harriet sat beside Daisy. Mary looked between Harriet and Daisy warily. Please tell me you didn't actually go to your aunt and ask her to just choose a man for you to marry. You know that's not what I wanted. Daisy hid her smile as she looked down at her hands. She didn't say anything, using her shyness as a cover. She did not want to have to be the one to break the news to her mother that she was about to move to Montana. Harriet looked over at Daisy, and seeing her head bowed, put her hand over hers to try to give her confidence. She wasn't sure how to help Daisy face her mother, but she knew she needed to. Daisy did come to me to find her a husband, and I think I've found just the man for her. Higgins has investigated him, and we've only heard good things about him. Mary sighed. Please tell me you haven't agreed to marry him. Invite him over for supper and let us get to know him first. Harriet looked at Daisy, who was still staring down at her hands, and she realized that Daisy was planning to let her do all the talking. She sighed. If it had been any of her nieces, but Daisy, she wouldn't have done it. That's not possible, I'm afraid. Eli lives in Montana. Montana? Mary's voice was shrill and panicked. You're sending my daughter off to Montana to marry a total stranger? She was not raised to be a mail-order bride. Daisy looked up for the first time and saw the utter panic in her mother's eyes. Mama, I've thought long and hard about this. There's no man I'm interested in here in Seattle. My whole life I've felt like just another of the flower girls. In Montana, I'll be a person in my own right. Fred watched his daughter carefully. I think she should go. His words were soft, but they were spoken with a finality that had Daisy smiling. Her mother never argued with him when he used that tone. Mary stared at him in shock. What do you mean, you think she should go? Fred shrugged, slightly afraid now that his wife's attentions were on him. Daisy doesn't thrive here like our other girls do. She really does live in their shadows. I want her to be happy, and I can see that she won't be if she stays here. Higgins checked the man out, so he must be a good man, and she knows that if anything happens, she can catch the first train home. He looked at Daisy. I wish you every happiness. Daisy stared at her father in surprise. In her experience, he never stood up to her mother. He made the money, but her mother was the one who made all the decisions regarding her and her sisters. She jumped up, ran around the desk, and threw herself into her father's arms. Thank you, Papa. Fred patted her back awkwardly. You just make sure you come home if he doesn't treat you like the princess you are. Daisy nodded, tears in her eyes. I will. Mary looked at her husband cradling their 18-year-old daughter on his lap and shook her head. She turned back to Harriett. Tell us about this Eli person. He's a rancher in Montana. He first sent off for a bride 6 years ago, but he was able to buy some more land and wanted to wait until he had the resources that he wouldn't have to work 16-hour days before he married, so he sent another letter saying to wait. He's doing well enough that he wants a bride now. He wanted a bride 6 years ago? Just how old is he? Mary asked, her voice filled with fear. Harriett smiled, having expected that question. He's 26. He was only 20 when he first sent for a bride. Mary looked at Daisy still curled up on her father's lap and sighed. I guess that's not too old for Daisy. She sighed sadly. I'm not ready to give my baby up, though. Fred smiled. You shouldn't have been pushing her to marry then. He patted Daisy awkwardly as she got to her feet and walked back to the couch to sit with Harriett. I'll be fine, Mama. We have some time before I leave as well, so you can help me get ready. She smiled at her mother. I have ordered some work dresses so I can have something to wear when I'm cooking and cleaning. Daisy secretly loved the idea of cooking and cleaning for a man. She didn't remember a time when her family hadn't had servants, and somehow it seemed glamorous to her to work for her family. Mary wrinkled her nose. Well, you enjoy the cooking and cleaning. She shook her head. When do you leave? Not for another 10 days or so. My ticket is for January 5th. Daisy smiled happily. The worst of it was over. Her parents knew what she was doing, and her father was on her side. 10 days? That doesn't give us much time. Mama, we don't need much time. I have what I need to take a train. It's not like I need more clothes or anything. I'll probably have to leave half my clothes here as it is. Mary shook her head. You will not. We'll start sending trunks of your things on the train tomorrow and arrange for them to be stored until we get there. As usual, Mary was starting to plan and manage everything. Daisy looked at her mother, her brown eyes wide. We? She hoped that didn't mean what she was afraid it meant. You don't think I'm going to let you take a train all the way to Montana without going with you, do you? Daisy sighed as her heart sank in her chest. Her mother was going to go with her to be a mail-order bride? Of course not, Mama. Mary thought for a moment. We'll take Jasmine. She looked at Harriett. Can the younger girls stay with you? They could stay with their papa and the servants, of course, but Mary wanted them to be under the thumb of their aunt who wasn't so easily swayed. Not Jasmine, Mama. Anyone but Jasmine. She's your eldest unmarried sister. She'll accompany us. I'd say Amaryllis, but she has her work, and she's expecting. She shouldn't be traveling. Daisy sighed. Yay. Hours on a train with Jasmine. Life couldn't get better. You will not be sarcastic, Daisy Sullivan. It's unladylike. How long do you plan to stay in Montana, Mama? I have no idea. I assume there's a hotel nearby? Mary's eyes met Harriet's. Where did Higgins stay? There's a hotel in Billings, and he's not too far from Billings. Harriet looked from Mary to Daisy. I don't know if it's a good idea for a mail-order bride to show up with her mother in tow. Her voice was skeptical. Mary shrugged. I really don't care. I will be with her, and if he can't accept that, then I just won't be able to accept him as my son-in-law. Harriet sighed. I guess you're going to Montana. She stood up. I'm going to go join the others. Daisy watched her go, wishing she'd had her aunt as a buffer for a little longer. At least her father was staying. I'd really rather you and Jasmine stayed home, Mama. It's not happening. Mary changed the subject. So how many work dresses did you order? 6. One for every day of the week except Sunday, because I'll wear a church dress on Sunday. Most of the dresses that she wore now would make perfect church dresses. Living in the city was so much different than living in the country. Mary nodded slowly. That should work. You have a new apron, don't you? Daisy nodded. Yes, I made one a couple of months ago, for working at the women's shelter. Your life is going to be very different. You've never even fixed a meal, or cleaned a house, or done laundry. What do you think I do at the women's shelter? I don't just sit around holding the women's hands and saying, there, there. I work, Mama. I do laundry, cook, clean, mind the children, and anything else anyone can think of. I'm perfectly qualified to be a wife and mother. Mary's eyes filled with tears. I won't know my grandchildren. Daisy sighed. I'm moving to Montana, not Florida. Trains are fast, and we can travel to see you on occasion. Or you could take a train to Billings to see me. Yes, I could, and don't think I won't. No one thinks you won't travel out there, Mama. Well, poor Eli might, but he'll learn differently very quickly. The week and a half of preparation went quickly for Daisy. Her mother insisted on having a wedding dress sewn as well, which Daisy thought was a waste. As a rancher's wife, she needed to be more practical, and it just wasn't practical to have a dress she'd only wear for one day. She tried to talk her mother into having a dress made that would work as a Sunday dress, but she was adamant that her daughter would have a pretty wedding dress to pass down to her daughters. A bridesmaid dress was made for Jasmine, and Daisy held her tongue. She would rather have Iris, her youngest sister, as a bridesmaid than Jasmine. Jasmine was a practical joker, and you never knew what would happen when she was around. Daisy was not looking forward to the train ride if her sister was involved. There was no way she could get away from her. The night before they left for Montana, her family threw a small party. It was only family, plus Higgins's family, just like it had been at Christmas. Daisy found some time to be alone with her favorite sister, Amaryllis, by grabbing her sister's hand and slipping up to her room. I can't believe you're actually marrying a stranger and moving to Montana. What were you thinking? Amaryllis was obviously worried about her. Daisy shrugged, tears in her eyes. She would genuinely miss this sister if not all the others. Right this second, I'm not sure what I was thinking. Amaryllis hugged her sister tightly. At least you won't be just another flower there. Amaryllis had always known how Daisy felt about blending in with her sisters and not having her own identity. That's one of the things I was thinking. Daisy smiled slightly. I'm going to miss you, though. She sighed heavily. I wish I would be given the opportunity to miss Jasmine. Amaryllis chuckled. I wish Jasmine was moving to Montana, and you were staying right here. Who are we going to trick into marrying her? She shook her head, knowing the two of them would always be able to laugh about how horrid Jasmine was. Daisy grinned. I have no idea. There must be a very stupid, very smelly man somewhere in Seattle. They both giggled, and when Jasmine walked into Daisy's room where they'd been talking, their giggles escalated. What's wrong with you two? Jasmine eyed them both suspiciously. For all her mischief, Jasmine was very bright. Daisy shrugged, her eyes meeting Amaryllis's. Nothing's wrong. We're just talking. About what? Jasmine's eyes were narrowed as she glared at her older sisters. We were talking about how we need to find just the right man for you. You deserve someone really special. Daisy smiled sweetly. Amaryllis nodded to agree with Daisy. Someone who will treat you just like you deserve to be treated. Jasmine shook her head. I know you two were not talking about who I'm going to marry. When neither of them said anything else, she said, Mama wants you two downstairs. She said it's our last party with Daisy for a long time, and she's not going to let Daisy hide away with just you, really. Daisy and Amaryllis got to their feet obediently. We're coming. Jasmine left the room ahead of them, and the sisters exchanged another look and laughed some more. She is going to get the man she deserves, right? You'll see to it? Daisy asked. Amaryllis nodded. I'll do my very best. The 15-hour train ride the following day did nothing to improve Daisy's feelings for her sister. Jasmine didn't play any of her jokes, but she spent the entire trip trying to make Daisy fear her new husband. What if he has spots all over him? Daisy shrugged. What if he does? I'm not overly concerned about what he looks like. Higgins has assured he's a good man, and that's all that really matters to me. What if he has 15 dogs and lets them eat off the table? Daisy didn't bother to respond as Jasmine went through a list of things she thought would make for a terrible husband. Finally, Mary shook her head at Jasmine. Leave your sister alone. She took Daisy's hand from across the aisle. Are you nervous about meeting Eli? A little. Daisy had always been incredibly shy with strangers, so her mother knew the answer. She was no more nervous about meeting him than she was most strangers, though. Meeting anyone new was scary for her. She couldn't help but wonder what he looked like or how he'd feel about how she looked, though. She smoothed her dress down carefully, even though it wasn't nearly time to meet him. You can always change your mind, Daisy. Daisy shook her head. No, I agreed to marry him, and I won't go back on my word. Even if he's covered with spots, lets his 15 dogs eat off the table, and hasn't bathed in 6 weeks. She couldn't believe her mother would even suggest such a thing. She'd taught them all to keep their word no matter what. Jasmine smiled happily, knowing her sister had listened to everything she'd said trying to make her nervous. How about if you find out he's killed 6 men and buried them on his ranch? Daisy glared at her sister. Please just be quiet for a little while, Jasmine. She couldn't listen to another what if. Jasmine shrugged. I'm not sure if I can. Mary turned to Jasmine. You will be silent until we reach Billings. I don't want to hear another word out of you. Jasmine sighed and picked up the book she'd borrowed from the library. Amaryllis had told her she'd charge her triple if she lost the book, just because she was so difficult. The train had left Seattle at 6 in the evening, and they were to arrive in Billings at 9 the morning of January 6. Daisy wasn't certain if Eli would marry her as soon as she arrived, or if he'd wait a day or two. She really didn't know what to expect at all, because taking her mother and sister with her had changed everything. She had sent him a letter explaining that her mother and sister were coming with her, but she hadn't had time to receive a response. Chapter 2. When they pulled into the station in Billings, Daisy was tired, having barely slept on the train, but she thought that was probably good. Maybe how nervous she was wouldn't show through her exhaustion. She stepped out onto the platform and immediately started searching the crowd for Eli. She knew he had dark hair and eyes, which meant that his coloring was similar to hers, but that was all she knew. Was he tall and thin? Or short and stout? She hoped she would take one look at him and know that he was the man she'd waited her whole life for, but really? She didn't expect to feel anything toward him. She stood between her mother, who had rounded a great deal with the birth of 8 daughters, and her younger sister who was much lighter complected than she was. After a minute or two, she saw a man striding toward her purposefully. He stopped in front of her. "Are you Daisy Sullivan?" Daisy nodded, her heart sticking in her throat. "Eli?" she asked, her voice extremely nervous. He nodded, taking her by the waist and lifting her down from the platform. She was shocked that he'd take liberties like that as soon as he met her with her mother watching, but she said nothing. He was a handsome man, with short dark hair and a closely trimmed beard. She'd never spent time with a man with a beard before, and she wanted to rub his face to feel it. His eyes were brown, as he'd said, and she felt as if she were melting when she looked up into them. He leaned down and brushed a quick kiss across her lips, his hand still at her waist and pulling her closer to him. She put her hands on his shoulders to steady herself as she leaned into the kiss. She forgot all about her mother and sister standing there as she kissed the man in front of her. Having never been kissed, she was surprised by the intense feelings that washed over her at the feel of his lips on hers. His tongue stroked against her lips, and she parted them slightly, giving a moan of pleasure when his tongue entered her mouth to touch hers. She had no idea where the feelings were coming from, but she didn't ever want this man to stop kissing her. The sound of a throat clearing behind her brought Daisy out of the moment. She blushed and pulled away. She stared up at him in surprise, unable to say anything. She knew her mother would get on to her for her lapse later, but she was truly attracted to this man. Mary stepped down from the platform and glared up at Eli. "Please unhand my daughter until you've married her." Eli looked at Mary and then back at Daisy. The surprise was obvious in his eyes. "Your mother?" It had never occurred to him that his bride would bring her mother with her. She was young, yes, but certainly not that young, was she? Daisy sighed. "Didn't you get my letter? This is the first time I've been to town in 2 weeks." He wished he'd come in sooner, so he'd know what was happening, though. "My mother didn't want me traveling this far alone, so she and my younger sister, Jasmine, accompanied me." Daisy hated to admit that her mother had come with her, but she knew there was no way out of it. "This is my mother, Mary Sullivan." She nodded toward her mother. Eli didn't release her, but he did look toward her mother. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Sullivan." It wasn't, but he'd play along. What was he supposed to do with the woman now that she was here? Jasmine stepped down from the platform. "I'm Jasmine." Eli looked at Jasmine. "Hello." Jasmine smiled sweetly and curtsied. "It's nice to meet you. Are you really a rancher? How many cows do you have? Do you bathe at least once a week so you don't always smell like manure? What does it smell like when you brand your cattle? I caught my hair on fire once, and the smell was horrible. Is it like that?" Daisy looked down at her hands. What was wrong with Jasmine? Why had her mother insisted on bringing her? How could she get rid of her? Mary glared at Jasmine. "Hush now." She looked at Eli. "Would you mind escorting us to the nearest hotel?" Eli shrugged. "I'd be happy to, ma'am." He sent up a silent prayer of thanks that they weren't both planning to stay with him. He slipped his arm around Daisy's waist, making it clear that he'd do what the others needed, but now that Daisy had arrived, he wasn't about to let her go. "We need our luggage, of course," Mary insisted. He sighed. "I'll go get your things, and then we'll walk to the hotel. I'll have to walk back to get the wagon. There's not room enough for 4 people in my wagon unless someone wants to ride in the back." Daisy walked with him, leaving her mother and sister waiting. "I'm so sorry they came with me. I didn't know how to stop them." Her voice was low as she whispered to him, hoping her mother and sister wouldn't hear her. Eli looked down at her with a smile. "I'm not angry with you." He found the luggage and got some help putting it into the wagon before wrapping his arm firmly around her shoulders again and walking back toward where her mother and sister waited. "I still want to get married today." He watched her face as he said the words, hoping she was in agreement. By the way she'd responded to his kiss, he was pretty certain she was. Daisy nodded. "That's what I want, too. Mama won't leave until we're married. The sooner, the better." He grinned. You don't like your mother? She stopped walking while they were still out of earshot of her family. Honestly, that's not it at all. I love my mama. Jasmine though, well, I have 7 sisters, and she's the last one I would have chosen to bring. I begged mama not to let her come, but she just wouldn't listen to me. She sighed. Jasmine is going to be my maid of honor, whether I like it or not. She wrinkled her nose at him, leaving him in no doubt that she didn't like it. Eli laughed softly. We'll get married today, and maybe they'll leave on tomorrow's train. He walked toward them. Let's get you settled in the hotel, because I still plan on marrying today. Mary sighed. I was hoping you'd give us a couple of days to get to know you first. I don't think my daughter should marry a man we've all just met. Eli shrugged. The preacher is waiting for us. He led them to the hotel where Mary quickly secured a room for herself and Jasmine. Are the 2 of you going to stay at the hotel tonight? Mary asked. Her eyes went to Eli as she asked the question. I have a ranch to see to. I can't stay in town overnight, ma'am. Daisy and I will go to the ranch this evening. His voice was kind, but he obviously wasn't willing to listen to an argument about it. Mary glared at him. Well then, maybe Jasmine and I should stay at the ranch tonight as well. Eli shook his head. I'm sorry, ma'am, but that's not happening. Tonight is my wedding night, and I don't want my mother-in-law in the house with me. He knew Mary would consider his words rude, but at that point he didn't care. What man in his right mind wanted to be under the same roof with his mother-in-law when he made love to his new bride for the first time? Mary gasped as if offended. Don't be so crude. I'm not being crude, ma'am. I'm just telling it like it is. He leaned down and brushed a kiss across Daisy's lips. I'm going to go get your luggage. I'll be back in a few minutes. Daisy accompanied her mother and sister up the stairs to their rooms, a smile on her lips. She loved how Eli was handling her mother. She could think of no way that would be better. Once they reached the room, Mary turned to Daisy. I don't like him. Daisy shrugged. I'm sorry, Mama, but I do like him. She was surprised to hear the words come out of her mouth, because she'd never really stood up to her mother before. She wished her aunt was there to back her up like she had in Seattle, but Eli would back her up when he returned. Mary shook her head. So you liked that he grabbed you and mauled you as soon as he met you? She looked like she was enjoying herself, Jasmine said. He didn't maul me, Mama, Daisy said, ignoring her younger sister as usual. He kissed me. We're going to be married soon, and he has every right to kiss me if he wants to. He looked like he was trying to glue the 2 of you together, Jasmine said. What did it feel like when he stuck his tongue in your mouth? Did you like it? Mary looked at Jasmine. Hush now. Jasmine shrugged. Well, I want to know. Mary turned back to Daisy. A man who will those that kind of liberties as soon as he meets a woman isn't respecting her enough. Daisy shook her head. He's thinking of me as his wife already. I like him. She wasn't willing to listen to any more criticism of him. She was marrying Eli, and that's all there was to it. I can't talk you out of marrying him, can I? No, you can't. I came here to marry Eli, and that's what I'm going to do. I like him, and I want to stay here with him. Mary sighed. Then at least wait for a day or 2. We'll get to know him a little better, and then you can marry him. Eli stood outside the door, waiting to hear what Daisy would say. He'd made it clear to her what he wanted, so he wanted to know what she would say to her mother. Her voice rang out strong. I promised to marry him today, Mama. I'm sorry that you don't like it, but I'm a grown woman, and I'm marrying him. Eli grinned and stepped into the room. I have your luggage, ma'am. Daisy turned to him and smiled. My trunks are being stored at the general store. I have clothes to change into today in my mother's things. Eli nodded. I'll give you an hour to get ready while I go to the store and get your trunks loaded onto my wagon. His eyes met Daisy's. Is an hour long enough for you? He obviously only cared about Daisy's opinion and not the others. Daisy nodded at the same time as her mother said, "Not nearly." Eli smiled. "I'll be back in an hour then." He whistled happily as he left the room, heading straight for the mercantile. He was thrilled with his little bride. Back in the room, Daisy put her wedding gown on and sat at the small vanity fixing her hair, ignoring her mother's pleas for her to change her mind. Jasmine's eyes were dancing with mischief as she pulled her gown over her head. It took Mary a few minutes to realize her arguments were not being heard, and she changed herself. "Daisy, we forgot to bring daisies for you to carry. You can't get married without daisies." Daisy shrugged. She did like the flower she was named after, but not enough to not marry because she didn't have them. "It'll be fine, Mama. I won't be any less married for lack of daisies." Daisy giggled softly. "What's so funny?" Mary asked. "Just the way I said that made me think of the word lackadaisical. And that's how I feel about my lack of daisies." Jasmine rolled her eyes. "You aren't as witty as you think you are." Mary chuckled. "I think she's very funny." They all hurried around the room dressing. Once Mary was ready, she helped Daisy with her hair. "Why do none of my girls give me any real time to plan a wedding?" She looked at Jasmine. "You're giving me a good 6 months to plan your wedding. Do you hear me?" Jasmine shrugged. "However long it takes." Mary sighed. 3 days. "You're going to give me 3 days, aren't you?" "I'll do my best to give you at least that long, Mama. If you give me a whole 6 months and marry a man in Seattle, you'll be my favorite daughter forever." Daisy's face split into a grin. She'd thought a lot about getting rid of her status as a flower and how much she'd miss her family, but she hadn't yet realized that she was done with Jasmine. She would only have to put up with her on the rare occasion now. Jasmine shrugged. "I don't need to be your favorite daughter, as long as I'm not your least favorite." "I'm sure Daisy just got herself classified as least favorite by moving to Montana, so I'm good." Mary sighed, pushing the last pin into Daisy's hair. "We really do need daisies for your hair." Jasmine walked to a trunk and opened it, pulling a bouquet of daisies from it. "I went to the florist and got these right before we left yesterday. They traveled well." Daisy stared at the flowers in her sister's hands in shock. "You got me daisies?" What was she up to? There had to be an ulterior motive. Jasmine shrugged. "I didn't think anyone else would remember." "That was really thoughtful." "Thank you, Jasmine." Daisy knew her voice betrayed her surprise, but she couldn't stop it. "I can be thoughtful sometimes, too." Jasmine protested. Mary took one of the daisies from Jasmine and carefully pressed it behind Daisy's ear. "And you can carry the rest." She beamed at Jasmine. "That was very thoughtful." "I'm proud of you, Jasmine." Daisy watched her sister wondering what she was up to. Daisy didn't do nice things, just to do nice things. Ever. There was something up her sleeve. There had to be. She started at a knock on the door, pressing her hand to her stomach to try to settle her nerves. She was about to marry her handsome Eli. Was she ready to be a wife? She hurried to open the door while Jasmine and Mary stood back and watched. He reached out and gently stroked her cheek with his hand. She smiled up at him, so happy that he was the kind of man she'd always longed for in a husband. Why else would he be so gentle? He was perfect. Eli stared down at the pretty woman in front of him. How had he been so lucky to get a woman like her as a mail-order bride? He kept looking behind him, wondering where his real bride was. There was no way this woman could have been a mail-order bride. Were all the men in Seattle blind or something? He cleared his throat. "Are you ready?" She nodded, taking the rest of the flowers from her mother. "I'm ready." "You really should wear a coat. It's cold out." "How far is it?" she asked. She knew it was vain, but she didn't want to cover her pretty dress. If she was only going to wear it once, then she wanted her time in it to count. "It's a 5-minute walk from here." "I can go without," she told him. She wasn't sure that she could, but she was certainly going to try. Just the short walk from the train station had her nose completely numb. We'll bring it, just in case, he told her, his eyes never leaving hers. Mary and Jasmine put their own coats on, but they understood Daisy's vanity. She was normally the most down-to-earth of all of them, except maybe Lily, but her dress was beautiful. Mary picked up Daisy's coat and folded it over her arm. I've got it. Eli nodded at Mary. Thank you. Looking back down at Daisy, he whispered, You're the most beautiful bride I've ever seen. Daisy smiled. Thank you. She had no other words to say. She was too busy staring at her future husband. They walked the short distance to the preacher's house, with his arm wrapped securely around Daisy. She barely felt the cold, held against him as she was. He knocked on the preacher's door and opened it wide. I was expecting you a while ago, Eli. The older man sounded like he was annoyed that Eli had taken so long to arrive. Sorry about that, sir. I wasn't expecting my future mother-in-law and sister-in-law on the train as well as my bride. I had to make some quick arrangements to see to their comfort. The preacher nodded, smiling at Jasmine and Mary. I see. It's nice to meet you both. This is my bride, Daisy. Her mother, Mary, and her sister, Jasmine. Eli made the introduction smoothly. Ladies, this is Pastor Williams. It's nice to meet you, Mary said with a nod, not offering her hand. They were invited into his home, and he had Eli and Daisy stand in front of the others side by side. The wedding service was short and to the point. When Pastor Williams told Eli he could kiss the bride, Eli pulled Daisy to him and kissed her with all the passion built up inside him. He was going to be taking this pretty woman home and making love to her that night. He couldn't wait. Daisy clung to his shoulders as he kissed her, surprised when his tongue touched hers. She wasn't sure if it was proper for him to kiss her that way as a wedding kiss, but she was certain her mother wouldn't think so. She liked it, though. She liked everything about him. She moved closer to him and tilted her head to the side to kiss him back better. Mary cleared her throat, trying to get them to stop once again. She looked at the preacher and sighed. Daisy, that's enough. Daisy blushed, pulling away from Eli. Soon he'd be kissing her without her mother watching, and as nervous as she was about that, she also couldn't wait. Her eyes stayed on his, and she felt a flood of warmth in her belly. How could she be so drawn to a man she'd only known for a couple of hours? Eli shook hands with the pastor and thanked him for marrying them. He led the three women outside. This time, Daisy accepted her coat. He was almost disappointed, because it was another layer he'd have to try to touch her through. They all walked back toward the hotel. Is there a restaurant where we can have a proper wedding lunch? Mary asked. Eli sighed. He'd been hoping he could take her family back to their hotel and run off with his new bride. He could see that wasn't happening, though. Yes, there's a restaurant across the street from the hotel. He led the woman there, his arm still firmly around Daisy's waist. They got to the restaurant and were led to a table. Daisy sat quietly beside Eli, while her mother peppered him with questions. How long have you been ranching? 8 years. I came out here as a homesteader when I turned 18. Mary made a face. I thought you had to be 21 to homestead. Eli shrugged. I told them to put me down as 21. They didn't ask any questions. He had been doing a man's job for several years by then, and he wasn't ashamed of what he'd done. He'd worked hard and was proud of his accomplishments. Mary shook her head. So your land isn't really yours? You lied to the government? The land is mine. I've been on it for 8 years. He kept Daisy's hand in his firm grip. How long would he have to put up with these people before he could take his bride home? How many rooms does your house have? Eli shrugged. Does it really matter? Mary sat up straight. My daughter was raised to be a lady. It matters to me. Daisy wanted to throttle her mother at that, but she held her tongue. There are 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a parlor. You don't have an indoor bathroom? He shook his head. No one in these parts does, ma'am. Maybe someday. Daisy didn't like the idea of living without the convenience she'd always known, but she knew she could. The school she'd attended hadn't had an indoor toilet either, and she knew how to use an outhouse. It wouldn't kill her. "You'll need to put one in as soon as possible," Mary told him. "Daisy has never lived anywhere without a bathroom." He looked at Daisy, startled for a moment. It hadn't really occurred to him that he'd married a girl who came from wealth before that moment. She was so pretty that he'd been blind to everything else about her. "Do you mind?" he asked softly. Daisy shook her head with a smile. "I'd like one eventually, of course, but my life won't end because I have to use an outhouse." He smiled at her, thrilled she didn't mind. "I'm awfully lucky that you were the woman who stepped off that train." He brought her fingers to his lips and kissed them. Mary shook her head. "Do you think you can keep your hands off my daughter long enough for us to all eat lunch?" she asked. "No, ma'am. I don't think there's any way I can do that. If it offends you, I'm happy to take my bride back to my house now, and let you and your other daughter eat." The slight emphasis he put on the word "my" made Mary shake her head. "You're an insolent young man." Eli laughed. "No, I'm just happy that my bride is finally here with me. I've waited a long time to finally meet her." Their food came to the table then, and Eli was forced to relinquish Daisy's hand so they could both eat. They still stared into one another's eyes the whole time, and Mary kept skinning at them and shaking her head. Once the meal was done, Mary asked Eli what they were going to do next. He'd had enough. "I'm not sure what you and Jasmine are going to do, ma'am, but my bride looks like she needs a nap. She was on a train all night, and I have a feeling she didn't sleep well." He led them back across the street to the hotel. "I'm taking her home with me." He tipped his hat to Mary and Jasmine. "It was nice meeting you. I hope you have a safe trip back to Seattle." He waited as Daisy hugged her mother and sister before helping her up onto the wagon seat. Mary stood gaping at him. "You mean to tell me you're not going to let me see my daughter again before I go back to Seattle? I need to see where she'll live at least." Eli nodded, understanding that she would want to see Daisy the following day. He could be a crazed man who would hurt her daughter on their wedding night. "I'll come at 10 in the morning to get you so you can see the house and that I've not killed her. You may stay for lunch, and then I'll drive you back to town." He climbed into the seat beside Daisy. "Sleep well." He drove out of town without another word. Daisy was giggling softly as they reached the outskirts. "Mama really doesn't like you." He laughed. "She would have stayed for a month, wouldn't she?" Daisy nodded. "She doesn't know you. My oldest sister married someone Mama didn't know very well, but she knew him a great deal better than she knows you. And my sister stayed in Seattle. I married you and moved to Montana of all places." He wrapped his arm securely around her waist and brought her up beside him. "I'm glad you did." He smiled down at her, happy they were finally alone. She smiled, rubbing her face against his arm. "Me too." He kissed the top of her head, which was the only part of her that he could reach as he made the long cold drive out to his ranch. They'd had a few warm days and no snow since, so the land around them wasn't covered in pretty snow as it usually was. Instead, it was a dull brown that wasn't very interesting. Usually this time of year, everything is covered with snow. It's beautiful to look at. I love how everything looks covered with snow. So do I. He smiled down at her. You obviously came from a wealthy family. Do you know how to cook? He held his breath as he asked her the question. He was so sick of his own cooking, he couldn't stand it. He existed on beef jerky, bacon, and eggs. There was nothing else in his diet unless he bought a pie or some bread while he was in town, but he rarely went to town to get those things. She nodded. We had servants to cook and clean at home, but Mama made sure we all knew how to sew. I've spent the last 3 years volunteering at a shelter for abused women, though, so I know how to cook and clean as well. Good. That will be necessary out here. I know. My aunt and I talked about whether or not I had the kind of skills I'd need to be your wife. She blushed as she thought of everything being a wife entailed. Amaryllis had talked to her about what her wedding night would be like, and she was grateful. Her mother had given her the basics, but nothing more. Amaryllis had been a great deal more forthcoming with details. Daisy was nervous about the things that would happen, but she knew if she could do them with anyone, she could do them with Eli. She'd never been attracted to a man before. She looked everywhere as they drove, interested in her new home. It took around an hour to get to the ranch, and he hurried around to help her down. When her feet were touching the ground, he leaned forward and kissed her again. This time, she opened her mouth readily for his invading tongue, knowing what to expect. Her arms wound around his neck and she pressed against him, happy to have him touching her once again, but even happier to know that her mother wasn't there to interrupt them. She was out of breath when he finally raised his head. "Let's go inside. I want to show you the house." He grabbed her carpet bag from the back of the wagon, and wrapped his arm around her shoulders as he led her inside. "I've been working 16-hour days for 6 years, and I'm afraid the house shows it," he told her apologetically before opening the front door. Daisy swallowed hard as she looked around the house. It was a good-sized house, which she liked, but it was filthy. Everything was covered with grime. She stared around her in surprise. There was a pump at the kitchen sink, which thrilled her. She wouldn't have to lug buckets of water from a well. There was a sturdy-looking table and chairs, but no tablecloth or curtains. She could take care of all that. There was one bedroom on the first floor that he told her they would share. She peeked into the room, knowing she wouldn't be able to nap until she'd changed the linens. She also knew there was no way she'd be able to cook dinner or do any cleaning until she'd napped. She didn't think he'd appreciate it if she fell asleep while he was kissing her that evening. He brushed her hair from her face, his eyes meeting hers again. "You really should nap before you start doing anything else. You look very tired." He wanted his wife awake and aware when he made love to her for the first time. She nodded with a yawn. "I will. I'll just tidy up the bedroom and then nap." She sighed. "Do you have a cellar for food?" He nodded. "There's not much down there, though. We'll take care of that while we're in town tomorrow." She'd expected to have to help him stock up. He obviously didn't cook much for himself. He frowned. "I forgot about that. How long would your mother and sister stay in town if we never showed up?" She laughed. "Too long, probably. Mother would find someone who would drive her out here, and she'd give you a piece of her mind. Guess we'd better go get her tomorrow and hurry her along then." He brushed a brief kiss across her lips, worried about how tired she looked. "You get that nap while I work." She watched him as he hurried from the house, obviously intent on his work and forgetting about her immediately. She found some spare sheets in his dresser and quickly changed the sheets on the bed. She hurried down the steps to the cellar and found some beans. She put them on to soak, knowing that it would take a while for them to cook. They may have a late supper that first night, but he seemed the type who would understand about that. She crawled between the clean sheets and pulled his pillow to her, hugging it. It seemed strange that the first time she slept in his bed it was without him, but she knew by the way he'd behaved that wouldn't be a regular thing. She closed her eyes and fell asleep with a smile on her face. There was no doubt in her mind she'd married a good man. Chapter 3. After sleeping for 2 hours, Daisy got up and hurried around the house cleaning as she went. She put coal in the stove and boiled the beans while sweeping and mopping the kitchen floor. If only the kitchen and parlor were clean today, she'd be happy. Her mother and sister didn't need to see the rest of the house, did they? She had dinner ready by 5 in the evening, happy with herself for working so hard. She'd wanted to make cornbread with the beans, but he didn't have any cornmeal. She'd have to make sure to buy that at the store the next day. When he wasn't there right at 5, she kept cleaning, planning to stop when he arrived. She had the parlor and kitchen floor swept and mopped, all surfaces scrubbed and dusted, and the windows washed in the main part of the house when he arrived. He walked into the house and stared in amazement at all she'd done. His little bride knew how to work. He hung his hat on the peg at the door before walking to the sink and splashing water on his face. She hurried into the room when she heard the water. "You're back." He turned to her with a smile as he dried his face with a cloth. "Of course, I'm back. Did you think I'd gone forever?" She smiled, embarrassed now that she had been away from him for a while. I guess I expected you earlier, but when you weren't here, I wasn't sure when you'd come home. He walked to her, leaned down, and kissed her hello. The house looks great, and dinner smells good. What did you make? I found some beans, so I made a big pot. Sounds good to me. He walked to the table and took his spot while she served them each a bowl. He waited until she was sitting, before saying a quick prayer for them and picking up his spoon. His first bite had him sputtering. Hot. He took a huge drink from the milk she'd put in front of his place. Oh, I guess I should have warned you. Our cook at home always made spicy dishes. I like them this way, so I tend to cook spicy. She frowned. Do you want me to just add the spices to my food, or are you okay? He thought about that for a moment. It's got a good taste to it. Just keep doing it how you did this. I'll get used to it quick enough. The beans were really good other than the spices, but he found he liked them after the first couple of bites. She hadn't lied about being able to cook. After dinner, she washed the dishes while he watched. He hadn't meant to work so late, but with as much time as he'd missed while having lunch with her family, he'd felt the need to make up for it. Tell me about your family, he said. You said you have 7 sisters? Any brothers? She shook her head. No, just 7 sisters. I'm the 4th, and Jasmine is the 5th. Tell me about your sisters. Daisy sighed. She'd never really met anyone who didn't know her entire family, so it was a strange question. Rose is the oldest. She's perfect. Well, not really perfect, but she always looks perfect. She's married to Dr. Sean, and they have 3 children. Daisy respected Rose, but she didn't find her likable. She had a hard time feeling comfortable with her eldest sister. She married a doctor? A dentist, actually. He's a nice man. She put the last of the dishes away and walked around the table to sit opposite from him, smiling as he immediately took her hands in his. Lily is next. She's a tomboy. She married Daniel, and he's a nice man. We all hoped that Rose would marry Daniel, but he's really more suited to Lily. Then why did you hope he'd marry Rose? Did all of her sisters have flower names? He was the best of her suitors. She grinned. Rose had a lot of suitors. A lot. Every boy in town was in love with Rose, well, except for Alex, who was always in love with Amaryllis. Amaryllis? She's my favorite sister. She's the 3rd one. Lily is married to Daniel, and they have twins. Amaryllis is married to Alex now. They married a year ago, and Amaryllis is expecting their first. That's a lot of sisters to try to keep up with. She laughed. You'll learn them all. I promise. At least you've met one, which should make it a little easier. She made a face. Jasmine is the sister after me. Well, you met her. She's a practical joker and a pain in my backside. Eli laughed. I can see how she would be. Daisy frowned. She did remember to bring daisies for my wedding though. I'm not sure why she did something nice. She shook her head. After Jasmine comes Hyacinth. Hyacinth is just as quiet as I am. I'm super shy, but Hyacinth, I don't know how to describe her. Dreamy, I guess? She lives in her own little world and rarely knows what's going on around her. She sounds interesting. Oh, she is. Then comes Violet. She's an artist. She's really good, and not just for her age. Daisy jumped up, ran into their bedroom, and got something from her carpet bag. She made this. She handed him a small piece of wood. He looked at it in amazement. There were 10 tiny portraits painted, 8 of them were accompanied by flowers. The first 2 were obviously her parents. He studied her father, who was painted with a huge grin on his face. Mary looked just as he'd seen, and so did Jasmine. Each of the sisters had a flower beside their name. Why the flowers? Did she think you'd forget who was whom? She smiled. She made this for you. So when I talked about all of my sisters, you could put a face with each one. He was touched. This is beautiful. I'm going to have to write her a letter to thank her. She'd like that. She ticked through the names she'd given him in her head. Oh, the only sister left is Iris. She's convinced she's going to be a doctor, but I'm sure she'll end up being a nurse, because whoever heard of a woman doctor? Daisy frowned. She believed very strongly that women could do anything men could, but she knew others didn't believe it. I think a woman would make a good doctor. She looked at him in surprise. Really? Absolutely. Do you think women should have the vote? She asked enthusiastically. Well, I've never really thought about it. What do you think? I think women should be able to do anything a man can do. I think we're well past the time when women need to be kept in certain roles. He nodded, smiling at her. I can agree with that. Do you think a woman could be a good president? She nodded emphatically. I do. And I think that even if our generation doesn't believe it, future generations will. I had no idea I was marrying a suffragette. His eyes twinkled as he said the name, and she knew he meant nothing bad by it. I'm proud to call myself a suffragette. I'm just as capable of picking who should be president as any man is. He stood up with a grin. I think you are. He nodded toward the door. I need to go and milk the cow, and I'll meet you back here. I'm about ready for bed. She nodded, thankful for the time. She hurried into their bedroom and changed into a long white nightgown with lace at the collar and cuffs. It was a lot prettier than the plain gowns she usually wore, but she wanted to look pretty for her wedding night. She took her hair down and braided it carefully so it wouldn't tangle during the night and slipped under the covers, putting her arms over the top of the quilt. It looked like a brand new quilt, and she couldn't help but wonder where it had come from. She heard Eli come into the house a few minutes later. He removed his hat and boots when he came into the bedroom, and he didn't bother to douse the lamp as he removed his button-up shirt and work pants. He was wearing a thick white shirt and long underwear. She watched as he peeled off the shirt, but turned her head when he removed his underwear. She saw the room plunge into darkness and felt the mattress dip as he climbed in bed beside her. She laid there on her back while she waited for him to do something. She didn't have to wait long. His hand reached out and stroked her cheek lightly. I don't want you to be nervous, he whispered. She turned to him in the dark. I can't help it. I've never done this before. How could he expect her to not be nervous when she had given him the right to do what he wanted to her body? He smiled at her in the dark, his hand stroking her arm. If it helps, I haven't either. You haven't? She asked in surprise. For some reason she expected that men would have experience with this sort of thing, even if women weren't supposed to. Why does that surprise you? I've never been married. She shrugged in the dark. I don't know. I guess I just thought it was normal for men to have relations before marriage. Well, I never have. I've been too busy working my ranch to spend a lot of time with women. You've never come close to marrying? She asked. He shook his head. Well, one of my friends brought a woman out to me and offered her as my bride, but she was too old for me, and I wouldn't have had her even if she wasn't. Really? Why? He'd been willing to take a gamble on a mail-order bride, but had turned another woman down flat. That seemed a very odd thing to her. What was wrong with the woman? He shook his head. I could tell something was up when he brought her out here. He was obviously trying to get rid of her. She was a widow, his former sister-in-law, and his new wife wasn't real fond of her. Why not? He laughed. Turns out she was just plain mean and lazy. She didn't want to do a lick of work, and she wanted to spend all her time criticizing others. She sounds like a lovely person. Daisy was glad he hadn't married her. Not just for herself, but she couldn't imagine how difficult a woman like that would have made his life. On the outside maybe. He shrugged. She married this man I know, and she's a good wife to him. He doesn't allow for anything less. He tells her he'll toss her out in the snow if she gives him any trouble. Daisy bit her lip. I don't know if that's funny or awful. He shook his head. I think it's a little bit of both, but they get along well now, and seem happy. They've been married for 6 years and have 2 children. Well, I certainly couldn't be happy that way, but I guess everyone is different. I would have shot her within a week, I'm afraid, he said honestly. He leaned down and brushed his lips against hers. I much prefer a woman who is willing to work. I wouldn't have married if I wasn't willing to work. She felt the tingle starting in her belly at the feel of his lips on hers. They were lying in bed together. He wasn't wearing anything, and there was just her thin nightgown between them. She liked his touch, but was more than a little afraid about what was about to happen between them. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her again, but this time his tongue moved into her mouth to mate with hers. She stroked his back as she returned his kiss, enjoying the feel of his lips pressed against hers. His flesh felt warm against her hands, and she sighed happily. Their room was far enough from the stove that it was cold. She was glad she had so many quilts on the bed, and that he was there to share body heat with. His hand moved under the cover and he stroked down her back, touching her through the thin fabric of her nightgown. He cupped her bottom with one hand and pulled her into him, pressing her against his rampant desire. She felt something poking her in the stomach and reached down to push whatever it was out of the way. She wasn't sure what could have gotten in the bed since she'd remated earlier that day. When she encountered his flesh with her hand, she blushed profusely. How had she not realized? Eli felt her hand stroking against him and groaned deeply. When her hand moved away, he caught it and pressed it back against his manhood. That feels so good, he whispered against her lips. She left her hand where he'd put it, stroking his flesh. It felt strange to her, but she didn't comment on that as she touched it lightly with her fingers. Eli wrongly assumed she was ready for him and cupped her breast in his hand, while pushing her nightgown up with his other hand. He pressed his fingers between her thighs and stroked her, his finger playing with the nub hidden inside her secret flesh. Daisy shuddered in surprise as he touched her there. It felt good, but strange all at once. She knew from her mother's and sister's words that she needed to let him touch her there, but a lifetime of modesty was hard to combat. The tingling between her legs grew stronger as his thumb rubbed against her and one finger slid inside her. She pulled her face away in surprise, gasping. But, you're not supposed to put your finger there, she told him in surprise. He chuckled softly. I talked to my friend about how to keep from hurting you tonight, and he said my fingers first would make it easier. He pressed a kiss to her throat, biting it softly. She blushed at the thought that other people would know they'd done this together. How could she face her mother and sister the next day? She couldn't make him stop, could she? People are going to know we did this. He nodded, his eyes boring into hers in the slight light coming in through the window from the bright moon. Yes, they will. And that's okay. We're married. His finger moved in and out of her slowly, mimicking what he really wanted to do. Does it feel bad? She shook her head. No, just odd. But good? She nodded, embarrassed that he was making her talk about it. Should she discuss it with him? Should she discuss what they were doing with anyone? He pressed his lips to hers again as his finger picked up the pace inside her, moving faster and more frenziedly. After a moment, he removed the finger and added a second one, continuing to stroke her with it. She was surprised by how much she liked it. She moaned softly against his mouth as she felt something building inside her, just waiting to happen. He seemed to be able to tell how interested she was, because he removed his hand and pushed against her shoulders until she rolled to her back. He knelt between her spread thighs and pressed his member against her. She was startled by the feel of his thick flesh, but lay still. Her mother had told her this was her marital duty, and she needed to lie still. Amaryllis had said it would feel so good she wouldn't be able to lie still and would be wild beneath her husband. She was about to find out who was right. He pressed deep inside her, and she let out a gasp of pain. That didn't feel good. She wiggled her hips as she tried to get away from him, but he groaned and held her still. You'll get used to it, he whispered. Daisy hoped so. She could see that he was really enjoying himself, even though she wasn't. She wanted him to be happy though, so she closed her eyes and prepared to deal with the pain. He moved slowly inside her, stroking out and then quickly back in. Her eyes widened with surprise. It still hurt, but underneath the pain was something else. She felt it throbbing inside her. He pressed his lips to hers, his hands finding and cupping her breasts through her nightgown, his thumbs toying with her nipples. His hips thrust repeatedly against her, and she lay beneath him, enjoying the motions, even though they still hurt. It wasn't long before he let out a deep groan and collapsed on top of her. She sighed, stroking her fingers through his hair. She hadn't gotten the same intense pleasure he had, but it hadn't been all unpleasant either. Maybe he was right, and she'd get used to it. He rolled to her side and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. Her head went to his shoulder, and she curled against him. She almost wished she wasn't wearing her nightgown, because she wanted to feel him against her more. Her body felt like it was on fire, and she was restless. "I'm sorry," he whispered. She looked at him in surprise. "For what?" "It'll be better for you next time." She sighed against his shoulder. "It wasn't bad this time. It was supposed to hurt my first time." She had no idea what he was talking about. Her mother and sister had both told her that it was going to hurt, so why was he apologizing? He nodded. He hadn't been referring to the pain she'd felt, but to the fact that he hadn't been able to wait a little longer for her. She kissed his shoulder, trying to placate him. He sighed, stroking her back. If he didn't think it would bother her, he'd try to make her feel the pleasure he'd felt, but she was already settling down and closing her eyes. He promised himself the next time would be better for her. She woke before he did in the morning and decided not to change into her dress in case he happened to wake up. Instead, she put on her dressing gown before padding out into the kitchen to start a fire and fix breakfast. She was in the cellar when he came out of the bedroom, dressed to go milk the cow. "Daisy," he called. "Down here. I'll be up in a minute." She felt her face flame at the thought of seeing him after what they'd shared the night before. She waited until she heard the door to the outside close, before she hurried up the stairs and put the bacon on to fry. There was no bread, and nothing to make bread with. She'd have to get those things in town. Her only option for breakfast was scrambled eggs and bacon. She looked forward to getting some supplies when they went to town. By the time he came in from milking the cows, she had 2 cups of coffee on the table with eggs in a large bowl and bacon on a plate. He took the spot opposite her, and they prayed before eating. While they ate, he said, "I have a couple of hours I can work before we need to go to town. I'll be back here to take you around 9. Will that work?" She nodded, pleased that he hadn't commented on how red her face was. Hopefully he would assume it was the heat from the stove and not realize how embarrassed she was. After he finished eating, he hurried around the table to kiss her before plopping his hat onto his head and heading out to the range. She did the dishes in silence before hurrying to clean the bedroom floor and windows the way she had the kitchen and parlor the day before. Then she sat down and made a list of the things she'd need so she could cook for them. She wasn't about to let him go without decent meals just because he hadn't had the foresight to have food around when she got there. He was back right at 9, and they rushed out to the wagon. He helped her to the seat and drove toward town. "Are you happy you'll get to see your mother again before she goes back to Seattle?" he asked. She nodded. "I am. I know she seems overbearing to you, but she's my mother and I love her." She was still going to be embarrassed to see her, but she didn't tell him that. "And Jasmine?" She made a face. "No one ever wants to see Jasmine. The girl is demented." He laughed. "She really is your least favorite sister, isn't she?" Daisy nodded. "She is. Amaryllis and I tried to talk Aunt Harriet into making her a mail-order bride, but she wouldn't agree to it." "So you became one instead?" "It got me away from Jasmine," she said with a grin. Of course, she'd never intended for her life to go this way, but it had happened. She wasn't complaining at all. When they pulled up in front of the hotel, her mother and sister were waiting out front for them. Daisy jumped down and hugged them both. Eli helped her mother onto the seat in the front beside them, and Jasmine climbed into the back without being told. There was no other place for her. We have to get some supplies before we head out, Daisy told her mother. That's fine. I enjoy looking around stores. Mary's head was erect, and she was obviously annoyed with her new son-in-law, but she wanted to see what supplies her daughter would have available to her. They did their shopping quickly. Daisy wished they could have waited to go to the mercantile until after they'd dropped her mother and Jasmine off for the day, but she knew she needed to have food to fix for lunch. She'd boiled a chicken down that morning that they'd use for chicken and dumplings for lunch, but she needed to get bread baked that day as well. And there was not enough flour to even make the dumplings. Daisy sat in the middle, and they chatted on the way out to the ranch. We had breakfast at the hotel this morning, but it wasn't as good as it was yesterday, Mary complained. Eli nodded. They don't do a lot of breakfast business from what I hear. They're more of a lunch and supper type of place. Most folks around here make their own breakfasts. Well, I couldn't in my hotel room, now could I? Mary asked in a rude voice. Daisy looked at her mother with surprise. Be nice, Mama. The woman who had always lectured her and her sisters about being polite at all times couldn't have just been so rude to Eli. Mary sighed. I just hate that today's the last day I'll get to see you before I go home. She glared at Eli. He could have let us stay for a few days. There's a lot of work to be done at the house. I need to dig in and do it. Having you and Jasmine here would just distract me. Mary didn't respond to that, but she seemed to understand. When they arrived at the ranch, Daisy was all but wringing her hands together as her mother looked around the outside. This looks like a big operation, she said. Eli nodded. Yes, ma'am. One of the biggest in the area. He tipped his hat. If you'll excuse me, I'll get to work. I'll be back in an hour for lunch. He kissed Daisy. That give you enough time? Plenty, Daisy responded. I'll have it ready when you get here. She had left the pot of chicken on the corner of the stove to keep it warm. Daisy quickly made the dumplings and dropped them into the water with the chicken. She then showed her mother and sister around the downstairs. I haven't even been up yet, she told them. I'm sure it needs a good cleaning, but I'll take care of that after you're gone. Mary looked around the simple home, biting her lip. She hated that she was leaving her daughter in this place so far away. What can we do to help before we go? Daisy smiled and shook her head. There's really nothing. I'm planning on making a tablecloth and curtains, but I won't start that today. You don't mind if I mix up the bread dough while you're here? That will give it time to rise while we take you to town. Of course not. Mary was surprised by how well Daisy knew her way around the kitchen. She'd never seen her work in a kitchen before because they had servants at home. Obviously Mildred Higgins was a good teacher, because Daisy did everything flawlessly. Mary had been an average cook, but she hated being in the kitchen. She was surprised to see how well Daisy had taken to it. They had a good lunch with Eli, and after lunch they piled into the wagon to take them both back to Billings. Daisy was sorry to see them go, but glad at the same time. She needed them to leave so she could start her marriage with her new husband. They were keeping her from her responsibilities to him. She hugged her mother tightly. I promise I'll write every week. Mary sighed. If you don't, I'll be right back out here insisting to see you. Don't miss even a week. Daisy sighed. I'll be fine, Mama. He's a good man. Jasmine hugged Daisy. I'm going to miss you, but I'm taking over your room as soon as I get home. The room Daisy had before she moved had been reserved for the oldest child at home. Each of them had used it before moving out to Mary. Daisy rolled her eyes. You do that. She stepped back to Eli and leaned against him as he slipped his arm around her. You have tickets for tomorrow? She asked. Mary nodded. And I've already arranged to have our trunks taken to the train station. We'll be fine. Goodbye. I love you. Hug the others for me and tell Papa I love him. Daisy felt the tears falling down her cheeks, and Eli squeezed her tightly. Now that the time was at hand, she realized just how much she was going to miss her family. We will. Remember, you have a home in Seattle if things don't go well here. Daisy nodded. I won't forget. Eli helped her into the wagon and she turned around and waved until she could no longer see them. I'm going to miss my family. She sniffled daintily and pulled a handkerchief from her purse which she used to wipe her eyes and her nose. He looked at her thoughtfully. Do you regret coming here to marry me? Now that he'd met her, he didn't want to think about what life without her would be like. He couldn't stand the thought of her moving back to Seattle. She shook her head. Oh no, of course not. I'll just miss them. That's all. They've been my whole life for 18 years. I know. He patted her arm gently while she rested her head on his shoulder. What about your family? When did you see them last? He hadn't mentioned his family to her yet at all. She knew she should have asked the previous night, but she was so busy answering his questions she hadn't gotten around to it. He shrugged. I have no idea. I was sent west on an orphan train that left New York. I was wandering the streets, and the good people of the city didn't want orphans on their streets anymore. He kept his voice even as he told her, because he didn't want her to dwell on his words. He didn't want his pretty new wife to feel sorry for him as she realized just how different their upbringings had been. How old were you? She asked in shock. Oh, I was 7 or 8. No one is real sure. I don't remember anything before living on the streets and begging for food. There were a bunch of us who would sleep in an alley together. So who did you live with when you came out here? I was taken in by a rancher and his family, but they made it real clear I was there to work and nothing else. They let me go to school when someone came around complaining about me not going, but for the most part, I was free labor for them. I left when I was old enough, worked for a couple of other ranchers in the area, and then I heard there was land available in Montana, so I came out here. Where did the orphan train leave you? She had heard stories like his, but had never met anyone who had actually lived through that. In South Dakota. I lived there from around 8 till I was around 18. By the time I left, I could do some simple reading and a little math. I've kept working at that so I could better myself. I have several books if you ever feel like reading one. He enjoyed reading, and when he wasn't too tired at the end of a long day, he spent time in the parlor doing just that. Thank you. She looked at him again in surprise. He was such a gentle man that she was surprised to hear of his difficult upbringing. They were silent the rest of the way to the ranch. When they got there, he helped her down. Would you mind just having chicken and dumplings for supper? I can cook something else if you want, but that would be easier, because I need to bake bread today. That would be fine, he told her. I liked your chicken and dumplings. It had been really spicy again, but her mother and sister had obviously enjoyed it, so he knew it was something they were all used to. He kissed her quickly and started to unhitch the wagon. She rushed into the house to bake the bread. The nice weather was holding out, so she wanted to get all the laundry done up in the next day or two as well. She had a lot to do to make the ranch a home, and she was determined to do it as quickly as she could. She wanted to make the best life she could for her new husband. Chapter 4. That evening when he came to bed, Eli moved more slowly than he had the night before. He carefully stripped her out of her nightgown and stroked her body until she felt like she was on fire. She returned each of his kisses and strokes until she was arching up toward his hand, all but begging for him to make love with her. When he covered her body and moved inside her, she felt no pain but only pleasure. He kept stroking her to be certain she reached her peak before he was finished, and she arched her back, letting out a loud moan as her pleasure overtook her. She curled into his arms afterward, feeling as if all the bones had melted out of her body, and sighed contentedly. He smiled as he stroked his hand down her hair. I told you it would be better this time. She pressed a kiss to his shoulder. And you were right. I could do that every day. He laughed. I'm very glad to hear that, because that sounds good to me. She fell asleep that night with a smile on her lips, knowing that her marriage was going to work. She had a good husband, and she could do whatever it took to make him love her. By the time they went to church on Sunday, she had gotten the house completely in order. The curtains were made and hung at the windows, and the tablecloth was spread across the table nicely. She got up and dressed for the day, surprised when he didn't immediately do the same. "You don't go to church?" she asked. She'd never known anyone who didn't go to church every week. She was certain there were people in Seattle who didn't go, but she'd never crossed paths with them. He sighed. "I do sometimes, but not every week." "Why not?" She'd gone to church every Sunday of her life except when she was sick. He shrugged and turned back to the bedroom. "I'll get dressed for church." She smiled, pleased. She didn't want to force him to go, but she wouldn't feel right if she missed. When they reached the church, he helped her down and introduced her to the small congregation there. His friends Clara and Albert were there, and they greeted him. Clara clapped her hands together happily. "Elizabeth finally sent a bride. Are you from Beckham?" The blonde woman had a glow about her that Daisy was both drawn to and envied all at once. Daisy shook her head. "I'm not. I'm from Seattle. My aunt was the matchmaker before Elizabeth, and somehow she ended up with his letter. She sent me out to marry him." Clara looked stunned for a moment before she laughed. "Trust Eli to do things backwards. He's the only man in the world to get a mail-order bride from the West." Daisy smiled, liking the other woman immediately. After the service, Clara made a beeline for Daisy. "Would you two like to come over for Sunday dinner? I'd love to get to know you better, and our husbands are close friends." Daisy looked over at Eli questioningly. He nodded. "We'd love to." She had a pot of beans soaking at home, but she could easily cook them for supper instead. She liked the idea of getting to know Eli's friends. Clara had a beautiful young daughter named Natalie, who looked right around Daisy's age. She wondered why Eli hadn't married her until Natalie called Eli Uncle Eli, and then she understood perfectly. While she was of an age to marry him, she'd been raised to think of him as an uncle. While the three of them fixed lunch together, leaving Gertrude to mind the small children, Clara talked about how she'd come to Montana as a mail-order bride herself. "I love it here. I can't imagine going back to Beckham. My aunt still talks about Beckham occasionally. She says it was a good place for her." Daisy felt like she had a connection to this woman, simply because her aunt had lived in the town Clara had lived in before moving to Montana. "I never knew your aunt, but I knew the girl who took her place, and she spoke highly of her." Daisy smiled at Natalie. "How old are you?" She gauged the girl to be close to her own age, but sometimes it was hard to tell. "I'm 16. The girl's eyes shined with excitement. Daisy wondered about that, but didn't ask. Clara sighed. Now that she's 16, she's allowed to go on sleigh rides or buggy rides with boys as long as we approve of them, and someone asked her to go for a buggy ride this afternoon at church. She's not going to marry for another 2 years at least, but she can go for a buggy ride. The emphasis on 2 years was obviously for Natalie's sake, and she wrinkled her nose at the words. "Charles is coming to take me for a ride after we have lunch today. He said he'd be here around 3. Daisy grinned. She remembered how much fun Rose had with all her suitors, but she'd never really experienced that herself. "I hope you have fun. My parents wouldn't even let us court until we were 18, so I never got to go on any buggy rides." Natalie's jaw fell open. 18? Before you can court? I thought my parents were old-fashioned. My oldest sister didn't have a lot of rules, and she had 20 suitors. They pretty much took over our house, until our parents instituted that rule." Clara chuckled. "Natalie? If you have 20 suitors at one time, I'm going to make you wait until you're 18 to court as well." Natalie wrinkled her nose, which was just like her mother's. "Why would I need more than one suitor when I have Charles? He's the man I'll marry someday." Daisy choked back a laugh. She liked the girl, who was a very hard worker. "How old is Charles?" She wanted to call him Sir Charles, but she didn't want to offend anyone. Clara sighed. "He's 19. A little older than I would like right now, but he'll be a good age for her when she's 18 and he's 21. She turned away from Natalie. "How many sisters do you have?" You mentioned your oldest, so I assume there are at least 2 or 3? I have 7 sisters and no brothers. 7 sisters. Oh my. Yes, 7. And we all have flower names: Rose, Lily, Amaryllis, Daisy, Jasmine, Hyacinth, Violet, and Iris. If I'd stayed in Seattle, I'd always have been known as one of the flowers. She sighed. She was so happy to be away from all of her sisters and the nicknames that came with having the same names. She'd been asked more times than she could count if she liked living in a garden. She hated not being an individual. I would hate that. Clara shook her head. Is that why you decided to be a mail-order bride? Daisy shrugged. Honestly, I'm very shy, and my mother was on my case all the time about marrying. I went to my aunt and told her to make me a match, because she used to be a matchmaker. She got a letter about Eli from Elizabeth, and she decided to talk to me about it. I liked the idea of escaping from flower status and being Daisy in my own right, so I agreed. How did your parents feel about it? Not happy. My papa readily agreed, but my mother came out here with me and brought my sister, Jasmine. Daisy shook her head, still not believing she'd brought her mother with her to be a mail-order bride. Clara choked back a laugh. Seattle isn't that far by train. Not nearly far enough. I think I can understand why you'd say that. Clara put the last dish on the table. Natalie, go and call the men for supper. Natalie hurried to the door to do her mother's bidding, calling in the 2 men and the 2 boys who were working with them. Daisy watched her run outside to call them and turned to Clara. Are they really working out there? Clara shook her head. They're standing in the barn talking about men things. They'll come in and act like they've worked, but when I ask Clarence later, he'll admit the truth. Daisy grinned. It must be nice to have a spy. Oh, it is. He's 14 now, though, and his loyalty is more for Albert than it is for me at this point. That's not good. Oh, Clarence has always dreamed of being a cowboy, and he's getting to live the life he wanted, and he's being taught to do it. He practically worships Albert. I can see that. Clara and Albert had 7 children. She had explained that 2 were hers from her first marriage, and after she'd been widowed she'd come west to marry Albert, who had 2 as well. They'd had 3 together. Daisy had always thought she'd have a large family like her mother, but she wasn't certain how she felt about it now that she was seeing it from the other side. She'd never had a friend with so many children before. They crowded around the table and Samuel said the prayer for them. Eli sat beside Daisy and squeezed her hand under the table. You okay? He asked. He had realized while standing out in the barn talking that even though Daisy had seemed comfortable with Clara, he probably should have stayed in the house because of how shy she was. She nodded. I like your friends, he smiled, patting her knee. I do too. They're good people. They stayed around after lunch for long enough for Daisy to help with the dishes, but Natalie was nervous about Daisy and Eli being there when her beau arrived. What she thought they'd do, Daisy wasn't sure, but she didn't mind. Eli helped her into the wagon, and they drove home, traveling on roads she'd never seen. They passed a small stream, and he slowed a bit. The day was unseasonably warm, and they enjoyed the weather. I'm glad you liked my friends. She smiled at him, her eyes lit up. Me too. It's going to be nice to have friends who we both enjoy being around. She rested her head against his shoulder, loving being close to him. What did you men do outside? He shrugged. We always tell Clara we work, but mainly we stand around talking in the barn. So why do you tell Clara that you're working? Daisy was inordinately pleased that he'd told her the truth about what they'd done. He chuckled. Albert doesn't want her to send all the children outside with us, and if she thinks we're working, she doesn't. Daisy laughed. He doesn't like the children? Oh, he loves the children. He just likes to stand around and talk without them going back and telling her everything. He helped her down when they got back to the house. She went inside while he unhitched the horses. She was surprised when he followed her into the house. He headed for the bedroom. I'm going to change clothes and go check on the cattle. Daisy bit her lip as she watched him go. He'd said in his letter that he finally had time for a wife. He didn't act as if he did, but instead acted like he had time to eat the food a wife cooked and make love with a wife every night, but actually spending time with a wife seemed to be beyond him. She sighed. She hoped he had feelings for her, but he certainly didn't seem to. She made the cornbread for dinner and mixed up batter for a cake. She'd heard the expression saying, "The way to a man's heart is through his stomach." She wanted Eli's heart. He was a good man, and she wanted more of him than he seemed willing to give her. Eli had enjoyed watching Daisy with his friends all day, but he was still afraid she would turn tail and go home. He wasn't sure what made him worry about that with her, because she'd told him that she was happier with him, but he just had a feeling in his gut that she was going to leave him. He'd never really had a constant in his life. Albert had been his friend for 8 years, and that was the longest he'd ever known and cared about anyone. He changed hurriedly and left the house, this time foregoing the kiss he usually left her with. He was afraid he'd get too attached and she'd leave. He wasn't risking his heart. Daisy spent the rest of the day alone, working in the house. She'd already cleaned it to the point where it was immaculate, and there was nothing left to do there. She'd done the small amount of decorating she needed to do. She looked around. What was left? She went to their room and went through his clothes for things that needed to be mended. That would keep her busy for a while. She sat down and worked on the clothes while she waited for her cake to bake, deciding to top it with whipped cream, because she didn't have anything else to use for icing. She doubled his wardrobe that day by mending the things he'd stacked into a corner and stopped wearing. She finished the clothes just as he walked into the house at the end of the day. After serving them both, Daisy took her spot across the table from him. He said a brief prayer for them both, and they ate their supper. Eli didn't have much to say throughout the meal, and she didn't press him. When she brought out the cake, his eyes lit up. She cut him a large piece and topped it with the whipped cream, placing it in front of him. "This looks delicious," he told her. "I hope it tastes good. I've made a few cakes on my own, but Mrs. Higgins was always watching me." She watched as he cut into the piece with his fork, hoping he'd like it. She held her breath until he smiled as he took the first bite, obviously content. "Who's Mrs. Higgins?" "I've done a lot of volunteer work at a women's shelter in Seattle, and she and her husband ran it." "What's a women's shelter?" Eli made a face, because he'd never heard of such a thing. "What would a woman need shelter from?" "That's a fair question," Daisy told him. "It's a place where a woman who is being treated unkindly by her husband can go to live with her children and not have to worry about being hurt any longer." "So it's a place where women are hidden from their husbands?" He seemed very annoyed at the idea. "Yes, but only if their husbands have hurt them. Many of the women there have broken bones and bruises all over them from their husbands." He seemed to take that in for a moment. "Are there a lot of places like that?" Daisy shrugged. "The one in Seattle is the only shelter I've ever heard of, but I think they should be all over. Women shouldn't have to stay in a situation where they're being hurt." He shook his head. "No. Men shouldn't ever use their strength against women. I know they do it, though." As much as he hated the idea of her having a place to run to, he knew that women needed to be able to go to a place where they were safe. Mrs. Higgins was in one of those marriages. After her husband died, she married my aunt's former butler, and they now run the women's shelter. There's so much to do there, with all the women coming in, that we've all taken turns volunteering there. The women help out when they can, but so many of them are so mentally hurt by the time they get away from their husbands that they need time to just heal. "So what did you do there?" "I cooked and cleaned," she said with a grin. "I wouldn't know how to do either of those things if it weren't for the shelter. We had servants to do all that for us as I was growing up." He sighed. "I worked my whole life, and you had servants." He couldn't help but wonder if the disparity in their childhoods bothered her. She reached across the table and took his hand in hers. "It doesn't bother me. I like working." He shrugged and ate the last few bites of his cake. "I need to see to the cow. I think there's something wrong with her." He stood up and left the house, leaving her sitting at the table. Daisy watched him go, wondering what could be wrong. She'd never seen him act so distant before, and she had no idea what she'd done to upset him. She had tried to be a good wife. While washing the dishes, she stared out the window into the darkness, feeling very alone. Her sisters had annoyed her a great deal of the time, but there was always noise and activity around her. Here, she was alone most of the time. She knew that would change after children came, but only God knew when that would happen. Maybe she could spend some time with Clara. She wondered if Eli would mind if she took the wagon to the other woman's house during the day sometimes. Clara could certainly use help around the house, even with Natalie and Gertrude there. She didn't know if she had done something wrong that he was treating her differently now, or if the first days had been an aberration, but she felt like something had changed that day. She finished the dishes and went into the bedroom, changing into her nightgown. She lay awake in bed for a while, wondering when he'd join her. It seemed like hours before the door opened and he crawled into bed beside her. She turned toward him in the dark, immediately snuggling against his hard body. He cradled her to him and made love to her. It was different that night though. She could feel his desperation in the way he held her and stroked her. There was something wrong, and she needed to find out what before her marriage was lost. At breakfast the following morning, Daisy tried to get to the bottom of what was wrong with him. She asked if he was feeling well, if he was worried about anything. He didn't respond, making her feel as if there was nothing she could do to reach him. Finally, she asked, "Would you mind if I drove the wagon over to Clara's house sometimes while you work?" His eyes met hers for the first time that morning. Why would you want to do that? Was she looking for a way to get away from him? An excuse to get on a train and head back to Seattle? She shrugged. "I spend a lot of time alone here, and I would like to have another woman's companionship at times." "Would that bother you?" "I'd rather you didn't." He didn't say anything else as he spread jam on his toast. She stared at him in surprise. He wouldn't even give her a reason? "Well, are there closer neighbors that I could go visit?" she asked reasonably. He shook his head, saying nothing else as he continued to eat his eggs. She frowned. "Could I drive into town and get the supplies?" "I'll take you." "Do you already need more things?" he asked. She shook her head. "I just wanted to see what you would let me do without you." "Don't you trust me?" She hated that he wouldn't let her do things on her own. It wasn't like she wanted to run amok with the horses and wagon. She just didn't want to be stranded at all times. He shrugged. "I trust you. I just don't think a woman should be running around the countryside without a man to protect her." Daisy gaped at him. "You said you believe a woman can do anything a man can do. That doesn't extend to your wife?" He eyed her carefully, obviously not wanting to say the wrong thing, but afraid to say what he was thinking. "Of course it extends to you, but you're new to the area and you don't know what kind of wildlife you could encounter. This is an area where there are a great deal more men than women. There are also Indian tribes still living around here. I don't want anyone or anything to hurt you." She nodded. "I'll learn to use a gun then. It's obviously the only thing that would make you feel safe when I left the house." She'd never really cared for learning to shoot, but her sister, Lily, was an excellent markswoman. She saw no reason why she couldn't be. He was surprised to hear her say that. "I can't see you using a gun. My sister, Lily, can outshoot any man I've ever met. And she can outfish them too." She shrugged. "I guess I should have had her teach me before I left." He shook his head, dropping his fork onto his plate with a loud clang. "If you want to learn to shoot, I'll teach you." She smiled at him. "I'd like that a lot." It would mean he'd have to spend more time with her during daylight hours. More time together was all she was aiming for anyway. "We'll start tomorrow. I'll spend 30 minutes with you every day after lunch." He stood and walked to the door, putting on his coat and hat. She watched him go, noting the annoyance in his step. Why didn't he want her going anywhere without him? The real reason? He didn't want to be with her, but he didn't want her to be with anyone else either? What had changed yesterday? She did the laundry and baked bread that day, keeping her mind off her moody husband. She sat down and wrote a letter to her mother and then to Amaryllis. In her letter to her mother, she wrote about how happy she was and how wonderful Eli was treating her. Her letter to Amaryllis was a plea for help. Please don't show Mama this letter, but I have to know how to handle him. He doesn't want me to go anywhere without him, but he obviously doesn't want to spend time with me either. I'm not sure what to do. We were fine, and then suddenly he stopped talking to me. I'm not sure how to go back to how we were. I want to go talk to the wife of his friend, but he won't let me go anywhere without him. What have I gotten myself into? She folded both letters and got them ready to mail the next time they went into town before she got to her feet to take the bread out of the oven. She went about her day as usual, looking for projects to work on. The next time she was in town she could get some fabric to sew him some new shirts, but for now, she needed to work with what she had. She found a skein of red yarn in one of her trunks and set about making a scarf. She didn't enjoy knitting nearly as much as she enjoyed sewing, but she would do anything at this point to keep herself busy. It wouldn't be long before she started going insane from boredom. There just wasn't enough work for her to do. The shooting lessons went well, and she was able to hit the target within the first day or two. Daisy wanted to be able to hit the bullseye every time, because she knew that when she got to that point, Eli would have no reason not to let her take the wagon to do what she wanted. She really didn't think his problem was her safety, but she couldn't prove anything until she could shoot straight and true. He took her to town to mail her letters on Friday. I think I'm close to being ready to come on my own so I won't have to keep you from your work. Don't you? She asked. I don't mind bringing you to town on occasion. His face was hard, though, and he no longer held her close when they drove. He only seemed to touch her when she initiated it or when they were in bed at night. He still turned to her over and over during the night. Sometimes they were both too tired to work the following day, but they both kept going. She mailed her letters and picked out some cloth for new shirts for Eli. They bought the supplies they needed and checked for letters from home. There was one from Amaryllis, and she clutched it to her chest. She would wait until they were at home to read it, though. While she was with Eli, she tried to give him her full attention. When they were finished at the mercantile, he looked down at her for a moment. Would you like to eat at the restaurant? We can't do it every time we come to town, but I thought you might like to eat some food you haven't cooked for a change. Daisy nodded, her eyes lighting up at the treat. She didn't mind cooking all the time, and she enjoyed the food she made, but sometimes it was nice to be served by someone else. They found a small table in the corner, and he took her hand while they waited for their food. She looked down at their hands and smiled. Why was he suddenly holding her hand again? I've missed this, she said simply. Missed what? He asked. For the first few days I was here, you touched me every chance you got. You were always taking my hand, or kissing me, or hugging me. It was endless how often you touched me. Lately, you haven't touched me outside of bed at all, except to help me onto the wagon today. She stared at their hands, unable to meet his eyes. Have I done something wrong? Eli closed his eyes against the pain that assailed him. He hated that he'd made her feel like she'd done something wrong, but he wasn't sure how he was going to be able to tell her what was going through his mind without seeming like he was a little boy. You haven't done anything wrong. I thought I was probably touching you too much. I've never really seen how a married couple is when they're alone together. She studied him carefully. I guess I can understand that. She sighed. I liked how you were when we first married. He rubbed the back of her hand with his thumb. I'll try to be more like that again. He didn't want to get too close to her and be broken when she left, but he didn't want to push her out the door sooner than she would leave on her own either. She smiled. Are you sure I haven't done something wrong? I don't want to upset you in any way, and if I'm doing something without realizing it, then I need to know what it is I'm doing. He shook his head. You're not, I promise. He looked into her eyes, and she could see the sadness there. Why are you sad? When I first came, your eyes were always so happy. Now, it's like all the happiness has been sucked out of you. She hated seeing him so unhappy. She wanted to fix whatever was wrong, but how could she do that unless he told her what it was? Eli shrugged. I feel like I should be spending more time working and less time with you. I'm going to put us into the poorhouse if I spend all my time with my wife. Daisy sighed. I'm not asking for all your time. I've never demanded more of your time, have I? She shook her head. I'm not lacking anything I want or need. I'm just happy to be with you when you have time for me. Eli felt like a heel. She was so open in her affection for him, and he knew he was growing to love her, but he couldn't let her see it. Letting her know he loved her would give her power over him that he couldn't handle. I have time for you. I just have to keep going with the ranch too. No one will watch out for my interests like I will. He trusted the men who worked under him, but he hadn't let any of them meet her yet and wasn't planning to soon. He trusted her, as much as he could trust any woman. What if she ran back to Seattle? He was getting used to hot meals and clean sheets. His clothes were always put away in his drawers where they belonged. He never had to eat at the bunkhouse with his men. Life was good now that Daisy was here. He didn't want to lose her, but by being so afraid, was he pushing her away? He hoped he wasn't, but he was very worried he was. Your shooting is getting much better, he told her. She smiled at him. Thank you. Do you mind if I start practicing when you're not around? She thought she could become a better shot if she could practice more and not have him breathing down her neck when she tried to shoot. Sometimes he made her nervous. He made a face. I'd rather you knew how to handle a gun better before you start practicing on your own. She sighed. She'd expected that answer. How am I going to get better without practice? You practice with me every day. The waitress brought their food then, and Daisy picked up her fork. I want to start practicing on my own soon. Please? He sighed. I'll work on getting you ready, but don't try it until I tell you it's fine. I won't. She smiled at him happily. He was still moody, but he seemed better that afternoon. She hoped she hadn't sent a panicked letter to Amaryllis too quickly. Chapter 5. Daisy sat down with her letter as soon as she put their purchases away. She curled up on the bed and opened the letter, her eyes eating up the words from her favorite sister. Dear Daisy, I can't believe how much I miss you. I know that we didn't see each other every day while you were at home, but it was different knowing you were in the same city, and I could walk across town if I needed to chat with you. Letters will never be enough. You need to talk that cowboy of yours into a trip home. I can't travel now, and won't want to for a while after the baby comes. Please come home if only for a week. I need to see you and know that you're okay. Bring the cowboy with you or come on your own. I don't care. I just miss you. How's marriage going for you? I hope you're experiencing everything we talked about. Mama would have been mortified if she knew I talked to you about those things, but I don't think women should go into marriage ignorant. Too many women do. I love you, and I'm anxiously waiting for a reply. Why haven't you written me yet? Granted, you've only been gone for 2 days, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't have a letter in my hand. Love you, Amaryllis. Daisy read the letter and laughed. She'd needed that piece of home to get her through. She'd wanted out of Seattle so badly, but now that she was in Montana, she missed her sisters. Well, most of them anyway. She brought up Amaryllis's letter during supper, hoping that even if he didn't want to go with her, he'd let her go for a week. He shook his head. You can't go without me, and I can't get away right now. It's almost a full day of just travel, and if you stayed for any period of time, which you'd have to do if you wanted to travel that far, then we'd be gone for over a week. She sighed but nodded in agreement. When you can go with me, I'd like to go. His hand reached out and squeezed hers. Are you that homesick? She shrugged. Not for everyone, but I miss my sister, Amaryllis, a lot. In her letter, she talked about how we didn't get to see each other every day, but at least we could walk across town if one of us needed to talk. We can't do that now. Eli sighed. We'll make a trip. Maybe after her baby is born, so you can see your new niece or nephew. Daisy smiled. I'd like that. I want you to meet all my good sisters too. And my papa. And my Aunt Harriet and Uncle Max. Oh, just everyone I love. He laughed. I can do that. He hated the idea of her going back to Seattle, because he was afraid she'd stay there, but he wanted her to be happy. He couldn't seem to make the two sides of his feelings for her join together. There was how much he cared about her, and there was the fear she'd leave him. How could she not leave when everyone else in his life had? Daisy sat down and wrote back to Amaryllis after the dinner dishes were done, telling her that Eli had said they might come after Amaryllis's baby was born. I want to see the baby almost as much as I want to see you. I'm going to be an aunt again. She folded her letter and laid it on the corner of the table to take to town the next time she went. Eli looked at the letter. More letters to mail? Daisy shrugged. Everyone I know is in Seattle. Of course there will be a lot of letters to mail. It snowed the following day. A cold wind blew in from the north, and by noon, it was obvious it was going to be a blizzard. Eli stayed in the house with Daisy, pacing the floor while she worked on a shirt for him. Every once in a while, she'd look up and try to start a conversation, but he'd shake his head and go back to pacing. It was too cold for him or any of his men to be out in the weather, but the cattle weren't always smart enough to get out of the weather themselves. There'd been a very bad winter 5 years previously that had almost wiped out his herd. Between the weather and buying the new land, it had taken him years to rebuild to the point he was at before. Thankfully, the blizzard was a short one, only lasting one day. He rode out the next morning and looked for cattle, the roads too thick with snow drifts for them to attempt the trip into town to go to church. She hated that she wouldn't have the fellowship with other women, but she understood the necessity of staying put when the weather was so bad. She was almost frantic by the time Eli came home early that afternoon. It was late, and he'd been in the cold for a number of hours. She didn't know how long he could take the extremely cold temperatures before he got ill. When he came in, his face was cold, and there was snow covering his beard. She rushed forward to help him get his coat off and rubbed his hands to warm them. "Why weren't you wearing a scarf?" she asked. He shrugged. "Don't have one." "I made you one. Didn't you see it hanging beside your coat?" "I didn't know it was for me." She shook her head. "I put it beside your coat so you'd use it. And I know you like your cowboy hat, but I've almost finished a stocking cap for you to wear under your cowboy hat." He nodded. "I'll wear them both." He liked the idea of her making him things to keep him warm, like he really mattered to her. Good. She ran to the stove and poured him a cup of the coffee she had hot and ready. "Here, drink this." She put it into his hands as she gently pushed him toward the table. How had he managed on the days before someone had been there to have coffee waiting for him? "I made a nice thick soup for lunch. Do you think you can eat some?" He nodded, his eyes droopy. "I think so." She put some into a bowl and took it to him with a spoon. "Can you handle the spoon?" She'd seen how badly he was shaking and wasn't sure he could get the liquid to his mouth. "I'm not sure." His eyes met hers, and she could see how tired they looked. He'd only been out in the cold for 4 hours. What if he'd stayed out all day? She sat in the chair beside him and carefully spooned the soup into his mouth, one bite at a time. He shuddered as the warm food got into his system. When the bowl was gone, she got him another. He was able to take the spoon from her that time and feed himself. She got herself a bowl and moved across from him. "Did we lose many cattle?" she asked. He shook his head. "One of my men is missing, though. I've got to get back out there and look after lunch." She knew he had employees, but that was the first time he'd mentioned them to her. She stared at him for a moment before shaking her head. "You can't go out there again." She couldn't live with the fear of losing him. "I have to. If one of my men is out there, and there's any chance he'll survive, we need to find him." Daisy grabbed his hand in hers. "I can't lose you." He stared at her in surprise. He hadn't expected her to ever say what was on his mind about her. "You won't." "I'll stay safe." There was a loud knocking on the door. A man was carried in across the shoulders of 2 other men. "He's alive, boss, but barely." Daisy rushed to open their bedroom door. "Put him in here." She hurried to get another bowl of soup for the man they'd found. "I'll get some soup in him, to warm him." She watched as the older of the two men who'd carried him in removed his boots and socks and rubbed his feet before putting him under the covers of her warm bed. "Get him into a sitting position." She sat on the side of the bed and spooned a bite of the warm broth into his mouth. "How long was he out there?" Eli had come to the doorway and stood watching her. "Longer than I was. He was out before me this morning." Daisy just nodded and continued spooning the liquid into his mouth. "What's his name?" "James," Eli told her. He turned to his other men. "Thank you for bringing him here. My wife and I will take it from here." He paused after a moment. "Get yourself some hot coffee and soup before you go. I don't want anyone else in the condition he's in." Eli watched his wife as she took care of the man, hoping he was just cold. "Did he pass out before you found him?" he asked over his shoulder. "No, boss. He was thrown from his horse and trying to get back to the bunkhouse. He was still on his feet." Eli nodded, thankful that was the case. He should make it then. Daisy practically ignored him for the rest of the day as she nursed James. By morning, the man was awake and back to a normal body temperature. Eli tried to complain about having to sleep upstairs, but he couldn't make himself do it. He was just thankful the man was alive. James ate breakfast at the table with them, recounting his story. "I didn't see a fallen branch because of the snow covering it, and my horse tripped, and then threw me. I think he was okay, because he ran off in the direction of the stables, but he left me to get home on my own." "Any idea how long you were on foot?" Eli asked. Being on foot in the bitter cold they were experiencing was life-threatening. "An hour maybe?" "Not that long." Eli sighed. "That's probably the only thing that saved you. That and your wife. I hope you know what a treasure you have there, boss." James winked at Daisy. Eli's eyes met Daisy's, and he nodded. "I'm fully aware. Thank you for saving me, Mrs. King." Daisy blushed. "I didn't save you. You saved yourself by not lying down in the snow and letting yourself die. You fought for your life, and that's what saved you." Daisy was clearing away the breakfast dishes when the men left. James had promised her he'd spend the day in the bunkhouse and not return to work yet, but Eli was going back out on the range. She wrapped the red scarf she'd made around his neck before letting him go. "Be careful out there." He grinned, kissing her softly. "It's not as cold as it was yesterday. I'll be fine." She watched them go, still a little afraid. She didn't want Eli to risk his life for anyone, including her and his cattle. His life was here in Montana, and she understood that, but she wished he was a rancher in a warmer climate. The Montana cold was starting to scare her a great deal. She had a big pot of stew on when he came home a few hours later, and she breathed a sigh of relief at the sight of him, rushing to help him with his coat and hugging him tightly. "I'm glad you're all right." He sighed, understanding her fear, but needing to alleviate it. "Daisy, it's so warm out that the snow is starting to melt again. This is the warmest January we've had since I moved here." She looked out the window in surprise. "This is warm?" Eli laughed. "You'll get used to it. I promise." "I hope so. I don't like you out in the cold like that." "I can't ask my men to do something I wouldn't do myself," he reasoned. "I'm out there working with them every day, because that makes me the kind of boss I need to be." "I know, but your men don't have wives. They're alone. You have a wife, and I need you." He smiled. "Their lives aren't as valuable as mine because they don't have wives?" Did she even know what she was saying? She stammered, "Well, no, but their lives aren't as valuable to me as yours is." He held her against him, trying to soothe her. "I promise not to take any crazy chances." "All right?" She nodded. "Sit and I'll get your stew." Eli talked about how the ranch had fared from the blizzard. "Our first blizzard this year, and we haven't lost a single head." "I'm thrilled. It could be so much worse." "I'm glad," she said, her mind still occupied with how he'd looked when he'd come in half frozen the day before. The cattle didn't matter to her at all. Not the way he did. She watched as he ate 3 helpings of her stew, before wrapping the scarf around his neck again. My men were laughing at me this morning. She looked at him in surprise. Why? Because my wife wrapped my scarf around my neck and told me to be careful. They thought it was funny that you mollycoddled me. James? He nodded. He didn't seem upset with her, though. You're welcome to mother me anytime you want, but don't do it in front of my men. I won't. I'm sorry they all heard about it. He shrugged. At least they all know I found a good wife. He closed the door behind him on those words, and she was thrilled. He hadn't called her a good wife before, and she took the words to heart. She sat down and finished his hat to match his scarf. She didn't want him to have to go out in the cold for one more day without a warm hat. By April they'd settled into an easy routine, each of them knowing what to expect from the other, and Daisy realized she was expecting, which would nix their plans to visit Amaryllis after her baby was born. Daisy sighed. The baby was due at the 1st of May. Should she hide it from Eli so she could visit her sister, or should she tell him? Maybe he wouldn't mind if she was a little bit pregnant while they traveled. There was really no reason she couldn't take the train. She decided she would tell Eli and let him make the decision for her. She wanted to see her family desperately, but not enough to anger her husband with a lie. She fixed a special meal that day of fried chicken and mashed potatoes with cream gravy. He loved her fried chicken, and she didn't make it nearly often enough to suit her husband. She made a special cake as well, wanting her news to be celebrated the best way she could. Eli walked in the front door with one hand behind his back. When she turned to him, he pulled a small bouquet of daisies from behind his back. She took them with wide eyes. Thank you. My flower. Her eyes filled with tears. She loved her namesake as much as her sisters loved theirs. He pulled her into his arms and kissed the tip of her nose. Did you have a good day? He asked. He knew she'd been keeping busy with spring cleaning and the house was shining from top to bottom. She nodded happily. I did. I need to go for supplies tomorrow. He'd been letting her go into town without him since the snow had melted, and though she'd missed him, she was pleased to have the freedom. I can't take the time tomorrow, so you'll need to go without me. Spring is my busiest time. That's fine, I don't mind. She set the platter of chicken on the table and hurried to put the potatoes and gravy beside it. This looks delicious. What did I do to deserve this? She laughed. I've cooked this for you before. But not every night like I asked, he frowned. It was the only thing she'd refused that he'd asked of her. I'm not cooking any one thing every night. She sat down across from him and waited while he prayed. She'd put the daisies into a vase and they decorated the center of the table, which thrilled her. I wish you would, he said petulantly. He was finally getting used to having her around. Someone who cared about what he wanted and needed in life and not someone who just made whatever she wanted. He loved it. I have something I need to tell you, she told him. I really want to go see my sister in June like we talked about, and I hope you'll still let me go, she trailed off, biting her lip. Eli gave her a concerned look. What's going on? Why wouldn't I let you go? She put her hand to her stomach. I'm expecting. Amaryllis's husband wouldn't let her take the train while she was expecting, and I really want to go out there and see the baby. He looked at her with surprise. Why would she tell him that way? Expecting? A baby? She nodded, her face lit up with a smile. A baby. You're going to be a father. Seriously? Do you know when? She shrugged. I think probably November. I'll see a doctor while I'm in town tomorrow. He frowned. I need to go with you then. Of course, you don't. I can drive the team just as easily as I could last week before we knew I was expecting. I'll drive them just as easily next week. Don't worry about me. Of course, I'm worried about you. That's my baby you're carrying. I'm fine. It's not going to hurt me or the baby for me to drive into town and do a little shopping. She smiled, glad he was concerned about the baby if not her. He shook his head. I'm still going with you. I don't want you to have to worry about anything until after the baby is born. The whole time they were driving toward town the next day, Eli could think of nothing but Daisy and the baby she carried. He wanted that child with everything inside him, which surprised him a great deal. He'd never given much thought to being a father. Sure, he wanted an adult son who would help him on the ranch and inherit someday, but he found he liked the idea of having a beautiful little girl who looked just like her mother. They could name her Ivy or some such nonsense. He pulled up in front of the mercantile and hurried around to help her down. While she went into the shop, he rushed over to the doctor to see if he needed to bring his wife to see him. "Doc, my wife is going to have a baby. Do you need to see her, or do we just need to find the midwife?" The elderly doctor smiled and clapped Eli on the shoulder. He'd seen Eli once when he'd sliced his hand open trying to cook for himself. "I wouldn't mind checking her and making sure she's okay, but I think a midwife is probably your best bet. They have a lot more experience with childbirth than I do." Eli loaded the supplies into the wagon before leading Daisy over to the doctor's office. "I don't know if I want you planting a garden this spring. It might hurt the baby." Daisy sighed. He was going to be overly worried about everything she did. "I'm fit. I'm a healthy woman. There's no need to worry so much." She smiled when she met the doctor. "This is my wife, Daisy. Daisy, this is Dr. Ash." Eli stood looking between them as if he felt completely out of place. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. King." The doctor was in his mid-50s and had silver at his temples. Daisy smiled. "You too. I'm not sure why I'm here, but if it makes Eli feel better, I guess you can examine me." The doctor smiled and opened his door wide. "Come in." He looked over at Eli. "This will only take a few minutes. Go get yourself a drink of something." Eli watched as the doctor closed the door in his face. He wasn't a drinking man, so he wasn't about to go to the saloon. Instead, he wandered over to the mercantile and thought about what he could do to make Daisy's pregnancy easier. He spotted the commode and bathtub in the corner of the store, and asked how hard it would be to install. By the time Daisy was finished with her appointment, Eli had gotten help loading both things into the back of the wagon and had a book telling him exactly how to install them in his hands. He rushed over when she left the office, wanting to hear everything from the doctor himself. "Is she doing all right, Doc?" Dr. Ash smiled. "She's doing just fine. Baby should be here around the 1st of November. Does she need to take it easy?" The doctor shook his head. "She's fine to do everything she did before you knew she was carrying. Don't coddle her." Eli nodded carefully. "I'll make sure she doesn't do really heavy work, though." "Well, she shouldn't lift anything heavy, but other than that, she's fine. She needs to keep active to make the delivery smoother." Daisy just shook her head. "I'm healthy, Eli. The baby isn't in danger." She patted his arm to emphasize her words. "Thank you, Doc." Eli paid the amount of money the doctor asked for before leading Daisy back to the wagon. He carefully helped her up onto the wagon seat. "Do you feel better now that you've talked to the doctor?" she asked. Eli shrugged. "Not really, he obviously doesn't know what he's talking about. We'll see the midwife as soon as we can." How could the doctor not see how delicate Daisy was? There was no way she was going to be able to handle the housework while she was pregnant. Chapter 6. The bathroom was in, and Daisy was just starting to show when June came. She'd put in a garden against his wishes, and was out in the hot sun weeding it every day. Working in the garden was something she found particularly joyful, and she found time to be out there every day. Both the doctor and the midwife assured Eli over and over that Daisy was safe to travel to Seattle in June, so Eli finally gave in. Secretly, he hoped that he'd be able to get her mother to back him up, so she would stop working so hard all the time. He walked into the house and saw her on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor and ran over to help her up. "You can't do work like that. Didn't the crazy woman know she was expecting?" Daisy sighed. "I want the house clean when we come back from Seattle. I don't want to come home to a mess," They were leaving the following day, and planned to spend a full week in Seattle. They'd be gone for 11 days total, and she didn't want to have to worry about anything when she got home except the garden. He sighed and patted her slightly burgeoning stomach. I don't want to risk you or the baby for a clean house. He shook his head. I like when the house is clean, but the baby is so much more important than that to me. She took his face in her hands. Look here, Eli. I appreciate the concern, but this baby and I are healthy as horses. There's nothing to worry about. She didn't add that she was going to finish scrubbing the floor as soon as he turned his back, but that's exactly what she planned to do. He frowned at her. I'm going to talk to your mother about how hard you're working when we get to Seattle. I bet she never worked this hard with her pregnancies. Daisy laughed. Sure she did. With all 3 of her first pregnancies. She shook her head. My mother has lots of stories about how hard it was to come west on a wagon train. You should ask her about it sometime. He really had some funny notions about her family. Your mother hasn't always been wealthy? He asked with surprise. She'd looked at his house as if it were beneath her. Why would she do that if she hadn't always been rich? Not at all. Her parents were farmers. She wants better for her children and grandchildren, but she understands what it's like to live on the edge of poverty. Is that why she seemed to hate my house? And why she complained? It seemed Mary had done nothing but complain the entire time she'd been in Montana. Daisy nodded. She didn't want me to have to live here, but Amaryllis spent her first months of marriage in a house with no bathroom as well. She shrugged. I don't think it really matters to her that much as long as she believes that we're marrying good men. Eli sighed. Well, I wish you'd told me that. What would it have changed? Just my feelings about forcing you to live a life of poverty compared to the life you've always lived. Daisy laughed. I actually enjoy housework. I like to cook, and I don't mind cleaning. I'm very happy here. I miss my family, but I think that's just normal. She wrapped her arms around him. I have a good life here. He sighed. She really didn't understand why he felt so guilty for taking her away from her life in Seattle. He couldn't imagine anyone choosing a life on a ranch with him over a life of ease with people she obviously loved. Being uncertain of whether or not she would return to the ranch with him made the trip to Seattle so much harder. Well, you'll be seeing them all in a couple of days. She all but bounced as she washed her hands at the basin. I can't wait. I haven't told Mama or any of my sisters about the baby yet, but I plan to when we get there. His eyes drifted to her stomach. I don't think you're going to have to tell anyone much of anything. She swatted his arm and laughed. I did start showing very quickly. She was proud of the bump her baby made, though, and she wasn't at all embarrassed. Everyone will be very surprised to see you. The long train ride to Seattle was so much better with Eli at her side than Jasmine. They talked more on the train than they had in a long time. He talked of his plans for the ranch, and she talked about how much she wanted to get done before the baby was born. I haven't even started sewing for him yet. Eli shook his head as he listened to her talk of the gardening and canning she wanted to do for the next winter. That's too much work while you're pregnant. Why couldn't she was working herself too hard? Daisy shrugged. I can get everything harvested and maybe Clara and Natalie will come over to help when it's time to do the canning. I'd love to have them over, and that's as good of an excuse as any. I wish you'd forget about the garden and the canning this year. We can afford to pay for canned vegetables at the mercantile. He didn't like to spend extra money on things like that, but her health was more important than keeping a tight rein on spending. She shook her head. But I want to do it. I love knowing that something I planted in the ground will feed us all winter. Her eyes were bright with excitement as she talked about her plans. I'd rather know you and the baby were all right. Plant a garden next year. I've already planted one this year. Why are you so convinced that I can't do it? Other women plant gardens and work while they're pregnant all the time. Did he think she was some kind of a wilting flower that couldn't handle the work of being a ranch wife? Other women aren't carrying my baby. Daisy sighed. He wasn't backing down and hadn't from the moment she realized she was carrying. How about I see a doctor in Seattle, and if he agrees with both the doctor and the midwife at home, you stop worrying? I plan on you seeing a doctor in Seattle. It won't stop me from worrying, but another opinion is never a bad thing. He'd known too many boys on the streets of New York who had lost their mothers in childbirth to not worry about Daisy. She was too slight to be able to carry a child and work as hard as she did. They had sent letters ahead saying when they would arrive, and Daisy was thrilled to see that her mother was waiting for her at the train station. She ran straight to her and hugged her tightly. Mary looked her up and down, and her face lit up when she saw that she was expecting another grandbaby. She looked at Eli over Daisy's shoulder. I guess she seems fit. Mary held her hand out to Eli. Welcome to the family. Eli's eyes widened, but he nodded. I wasn't part of the family before? Not until I knew how you'd treat my daughter, you weren't. Mary led them out of the station to where Fred sat in the family's buggy. Fred, help our new son-in-law with the luggage. Fred got down out of the buggy obediently, but he hugged Daisy instead of immediately going off to get their luggage. Are you happy? Daisy nodded, her eyes twinkling. I married a good man, Papa. Fred looked at Eli and held his hand out to him. I'm Fred Sullivan. Eli King, sir. It's nice to meet you. Eli seemed nervous to finally meet her father, and Daisy wanted to giggle. Her mama was a force to be reckoned with, but unless someone mistreated one of his daughters, Fred was very easygoing. Well, let's go get luggage, son. Fred walked off toward the baggage area, leaving Daisy standing in the street with her mother. Have you been sick? Mary asked immediately. She'd had easy pregnancies herself, but her daughters hadn't been as fortunate as her so far. None of the pregnancies had been particularly difficult, but they weren't easy either. Not really. I've been a lot hungrier than usual, and I finally feel the baby kicking, but that's the only way I even know I'm expecting. Daisy rested her hand on the mound that was her baby, feeling a kick in response. Eli's certain the baby is going to kill me. He's doing everything he can to make my life easier. You'll be happy to know we now have an indoor bathroom. She sighed, wishing she could put into words how odd he'd been about her working while she was expecting. It's about time. He should have started that before I was on my way back to Seattle, Mary complained. Daisy rolled her eyes. I did fine without it, Mama. I don't need a bathtub with running water now. It's nice to have, but I don't need it. The men came back with the carpet bags and tucked them under the seats. Eli carefully helped Daisy into the back seat of the buggy before climbing up beside her, his arm automatically wrapping around her shoulders. Fred drove through the busy streets, and Daisy looked around her for any changes that had taken place in the 6 months she'd been gone. He took a turn she didn't expect and Daisy started to ask where they were going, and then it clicked. He was taking her to Amaryllis's house. When he stopped the buggy, she jumped down without help and ran to the door. Eli watched her run from him, breathing a sigh of relief when he saw the house she'd run to. Somehow he'd pictured something much larger and grander from the way she'd talked about her upbringing. She knocked on the door and he watched as a young woman with blonde hair opened it and threw her arms around his wife. This isn't your house? He asked Fred. Fred laughed and shook his head. No, this is Alex and Amaryllis's house. I knew the girls would be dying to see each other. He tied off the horses and set the brake before climbing down and helping his wife. Those two are each other's closest companions and confidants. Eli got down and smoothed his sweaty palms over the thighs of his pants. He felt funny about meeting his wife's favorite sister, and Daisy had made it very clear Amaryllis was her favorite. The girls had just stopped hugging when he stepped up behind Daisy. Amaryllis smiled at him. You must be Eli. I've heard a lot about you. Daisy had written every worry she had about her marriage to her sister, and she was thankful Amaryllis was too circumspect to bring them all up. Eli, this is Amaryllis, who you've heard way too much about as well. Amaryllis opened the door wide. I was just about to put the baby down for his nap, but I'm sure he'd love to meet his Aunt Daisy first. Daisy rushed to the bassinet in the parlor and picked the baby up from his bed. Little Amos. She cradled him against her breast, smiling down at him as her eyes searched his face to see who he looked like. He is Alex's coloring, but the shape of his mouth is all yours, really. She looked at her sister and grinned. You did a good job with him. He's beautiful. I think he's Alex through and through. Amaryllis stood calmly by while her sister snuggled her baby. When is yours due? Beginning of November, Daisy answered, her eyes shining with excitement. Why didn't you tell us? Daisy shrugged. I knew I was going to be coming here, and thought it would be better to tell you in person. She winked at her sister. Surprise! Mary walked in and took the baby from Daisy's arms. That's my grandson you're holding there. Daisy sighed, knowing she'd lost baby snuggling privileges for a while. She took a seat on the worn red sofa and patted the spot next to her. Amaryllis sank down beside Daisy, and the two of them began talking as if they'd never left off. Daisy told all about the ranch and how much she loved Montana, while Amaryllis told her sister how odd it was to have a little person so totally dependent upon her. They talked over each other so much that it was hard to tell whose voice was whose after a little while. Eli stood watching the two sisters, feeling completely left out of the conversation. Mary took one of the armchairs with the baby, and Fred took the other. That left him to sit beside Daisy on the small sofa. She was completely turned away from him as she talked excitedly to her sister. After a moment, Amaryllis peered around Daisy. So how do you feel about being a papa so soon? Eli shrugged uncomfortably. I'm thrilled I'm going to be a father, of course, but I'm sure Daisy is doing too much. She needs to rest more. He didn't care if he had to shout it from the rooftops. Someone had to listen to his concerns. Amaryllis chuckled. Alex and I had the same fight. He wanted me to quit working the day we realized I was expecting. But you didn't? Amaryllis shook her head adamantly. I'm going back to work next month. Daisy looked at her sister in surprise. What will you do with the baby? Amaryllis smiled. Iris is going to mind him while I work. Daisy raised an eyebrow at that. Iris? You trust her with Amos? She's fabulous with him. She's 14 now, so she's old enough, and he likes her better than me even. I think if he didn't need me to eat, he'd want to spend all his time with his Auntie Iris. I guess that shouldn't surprise me. She was always good with animals. I can see where it would carry over to people. Has she given up on wanting to be a doctor yet? Daisy fervently hoped she hadn't. Her little sister would make the best doctor in the whole world. Amaryllis laughed and shook her head. All of your talk about women's rights made her believe she could do anything. She said she can't settle for being a nurse. You'd be disappointed in her. Daisy laughed. How could anyone be disappointed in Iris? Mary stood up, pressing a kiss to little Amos's forehead. We need to get our travelers home, but I knew you two would want to see each other as soon as possible. She handed the baby to Amaryllis. You'll come on Saturday night? I wouldn't miss it. Amaryllis immediately started swaying softly with the baby in her arms. What's Saturday night? Daisy asked. We're having all your sisters and your aunt and uncle and the Higgins over, because you're here. Daisy sighed. You didn't have to do that for me. She'd hoped to go around visiting everyone instead of having a big crowd of people around her all at once. She didn't enjoy crowds much, and from what she'd seen of Eli, he didn't either. She gave in, though, because it was easier than fighting over something so unimportant. Mary hugged Daisy. I wanted to do that for you. You're my daughter. Thank you, Mama. Daisy knew the answer was the right one, but it wasn't what she wanted to say. She looked at Amaryllis. I'll see you on Saturday night if not before. Oh, you'd better see me before. Amaryllis grinned at her sister while cradling the baby. We have so much to talk about. She didn't add that there wasn't enough time to say it all, but she knew Daisy would understand. Fred looked over at Eli. Those two girls could go to the same party and come home and talk for hours and hours about their experiences there. It didn't matter that they'd been at the same place and seen the same exact things. No, they had to discuss everything and everyone in minute detail. Eli helped Daisy into the back of the buggy. "Don't jump down like that without my help again. I don't want you hurting yourself or the baby." Daisy smiled as she rested her head on Eli's shoulder. "I'm all right, Papa." Eli threaded his fingers through hers as he watched out the side of the buggy. Everything was so different here than back home. He wasn't used to living in a city at all and couldn't help but wonder how she'd adjusted so easily to country life. His early years in New York didn't really count for him. New York had been very different than Seattle. The house Fred pulled up in front of this time was even grander than what Eli had expected. He'd known she'd come from wealth, but the extreme wealth he was seeing was shocking to him. He helped her down and grabbed 2 of the carpet bags from under the seat. Fred grabbed the other 2 while Mary led the way to the house. When the door opened, 4 girls came pouring out the front of the house. 3 of them were crying when they saw Daisy and throwing themselves at their older sister, while the 4th, Jasmine, stood to the side. She nodded at Eli. "So, having a baby, are you?" Eli nodded. "Looks that way. Works for me. I love being an aunt. I get to give the kids noisy toys and then send them home with their parents." Jasmine grinned, her eyes full of mischief. Eli watched his sister-in-law for a moment. Daisy had said she was a demented nincompoop and he'd seen her ask inappropriate questions, but he hadn't seen the behavior Daisy had said Jasmine was capable of. He hoped he never did. When they went into the house, Daisy turned to Iris. "Where does Mama want us?" Iris led the way up the stairs. "She put you in your old room. Jasmine and Hyacinth are sharing while you're here." Daisy chuckled. "Poor Hyacinth. No kidding. I don't know how she puts up with Jasmine. She's just a better person than the rest of us, I guess." Daisy walked into her old bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. She was tired after the long trip, and she wondered if anyone would be offended if she took a quick nap. Iris sat beside her. "How are you feeling?" Daisy smiled. "Sleepy. I barely know I'm expecting, but Eli keeps watching me like he's waiting for my head to break open any second." Iris giggled. "At least you know he cares." She squeezed her older sister's hand. "I'm glad you found a good man." "He is a good man." Daisy stretched. "I'm tired. That trip really drained my energy." Iris eyes her a little worriedly. "Baby's fine, though?" "He's kicking constantly." Her hand went automatically to her stomach, and she rubbed the small mound. Iris stood and went to the door. "You sleep then. I'll let everyone know that you needed to rest." Daisy sighed, nodding. She didn't want to frighten Eli by taking a nap, but she truly couldn't keep her eyes open for another minute. "Just tell Eli I didn't sleep well on the train, but I feel great." She frowned. "He'll worry." Iris smiled at her sister as she curled onto her side. She left the room quietly, closing the door behind her. Eli was starting up the stairs with their bags when he saw Iris shut the door at the top of the stairs and come down. "Daisy's going to take a nap. She said she didn't sleep well on the train. Is she okay?" Iris grinned. "She's the picture of health. She seems to be really happy." She eyed him as if she were sizing him up. Eli turned and went back down the stairs. "Where should I put these then?" he asked about the bags in his hands. "Put them in Papa's study. He won't mind, and Mama will complain that you're messing up the house if you put them anywhere else." Iris indicated a door just inside the front door. "Through there." Eli knocked cautiously and set the bags into the room when there was no response. He had no idea what to do with himself while his wife slept. "You're Iris, right?" "Yes, I'm the baby." She made a face. "Always the afterthought." Eli laughed. "Daisy has said nice things about you. You're one of her favorites." "Really? Tell me, does she have 6 favorites, and one not-so-favorite?" Her eyes sparkled with laughter. "I guess all of you feel the same way about the last sister?" Eli found the young girl's smile infectious. He'd never had a sibling, but he'd take this one home with him if he could. Well, everyone but Jasmine, of course. Eli laughed at that. So where should I go while Daisy is sleeping? He asked, suddenly feeling comfortable with this sister of Daisy's. We can go into the parlor and sit and talk to Mama and act all proper, or we can go out to the garden, and I'll show you the tree where Lily was sitting on a branch when she threw her shoe at her husband. Eli held his arm out for his sister-in-law, wanting to hear all the stories she had to tell. Daisy hadn't exactly hidden her life from him, but he had a feeling he'd get truthful answers from the young girl beside him. Iris gripped his arm, and they went out to the back garden where she told the story of how Lily had thrown her shoe at Rose and had missed hitting Daniel instead. He'd laughed out loud when she told him about how Lily had fallen out of the tree on top of him. And Daisy? Did she have a lot of beaux that she brought out here? He found himself very jealous of any man Daisy had ever so much as taken a walk with. Iris gave him a look of surprise. Daisy? Beaux? She's always been so shy. I'm sure that's why she went to Aunt Harriet and asked to be a mail-order bride. Eli hadn't thought about that before. He just knew he was married to an amazing young lady. Why she'd chosen to give up her comfortable life and travel so far to marry was beyond him. Why didn't she just wait to meet someone at church or something? Iris sighed. Mama thinks that we need to marry as soon as we turn 18. I don't know why, because I think it's ridiculous, and I'm not going to marry before I finish medical school. Daisy was 18 and a half before she got fed up with Mama and went to talk to Aunt Harriet. What does that have to do with anything? Well, Mama kept pushing Daisy, telling her she should marry, and finally Daisy went to Aunt Harriet's house and told her to make her a match. She wanted a man who would be good to her and hopefully love her one day, but more than anything, she wanted Mama to stop nagging her. Eli frowned. So she didn't want to marry? Oh, I think she wanted to marry. She just didn't want to have to go through the process of courting and finding someone to marry. It was too hard for her to talk to men. He hadn't noticed an overwhelming shyness about Daisy, but of course, he'd seen her and kissed her immediately. She'd been a bit shy, but she'd warmed up to him immediately. He wondered if things would have been different if he hadn't grabbed her from the train platform and kissed her the way he had. She misses everyone here. Iris nodded. We've always been a tight-knit family. It's strange to know that I can't just walk across town and talk to her like I can my other sisters. I think she should stay here until the baby is born. Eli blurted the words out without thinking. Why? She looks healthy. Is there something wrong that we don't know about? Iris looked at him in confusion. She seems so happy with you. It's like she's finally Daisy in her own right and not just one of the flowers anymore. Daisy had mentioned to him that she hated being just one of the flowers. Now that he'd seen her home in Seattle and met more of her sisters, he thought he understood. Both the midwife and the doctor say that she's fine, but I'd like her to get checked out while she's here. I don't want anything to happen to her. Iris looked at him in surprise. She said you were really worried. What do you think's going to happen? He shrugged. I'm probably being silly, but I'm afraid she's going to die in childbirth. Why do you think that? Iris's voice was calm and intelligent. She wasn't telling him he was being silly, she was just trying to reason with him about his fears. I don't know. I knew a lot of boys who lost their mother that way when I was a kid. Daisy's healthy and strong. I guess it's possible, but I don't think it's anything you need to spend a lot of time worrying over. She works so hard. She has a garden, and she cooks and cleans, and I just wish she'd slow down a little. It can't be good for her to work that hard while she's expecting. Iris studied him for a moment. Well, you know I want to be a doctor, right? At his nod, she continued. I've been reading a lot about women and what they should do while they're expecting. It seems that new studies are showing that the more active a woman is, and the harder she works during her pregnancy, the easier childbirth is for her. Eli shook his head. That makes no sense to me at all. Iris shrugged. It's almost like a woman is in training for childbirth. If you were training a horse for a race, Would you make him rest for 9 months, or would you have him exercise every day? I'd have him exercise, but I'm not training a horse. I'm hoping my wife doesn't die. It's really the same concept. She can't just rest for 9 months. She needs to be on her feet and moving like she always is. Iris was watching him earnestly as she spoke. Would you like to borrow my medical journal about it? Eli raised an eyebrow. How old are you? 14. Why do you have medical journals? Iris grinned. Because my sister is the town librarian. Her eyes twinkled as she said the words. Eli followed her reasoning, which frightened him a bit. I see. He thought about it for a moment. No, I don't want to read your medical journal. I do want Daisy to go to the doctor while we're in Seattle for another opinion, though. Iris shrugged. You're wasting time and money, but if it makes you happy, I'm certain the doctor will see you. She led him toward the back of the garden to the bench in the middle of her section. The English irises were blooming all around them. This is my section of the garden. It's pretty here. Eli sighed. I wish I could be certain she'd be okay. Do you think she'll stay here until after the baby's born? No, I don't. Why would she? If she's happy with you, then she'll want to stay with you, not come back to Seattle where she wasn't happy at all. Why was she unhappy here? Eli didn't understand what was better for her in Montana. He wanted to, though. Iris thought hard about the question. She just never felt like she was an individual. She's in a family with really strong personalities. She and Hyacinth both kind of fade into the background. Eli frowned. But she's smart and good and caring. She's a young woman with 7 sisters who all have flower names. I'm the youngest, and everyone knows me as the one who thinks she can be a doctor. Rose is the oldest, who all the boys wanted to court. Lily is the tomboy. Amaryllis is the bookworm. Jasmine is the joker. Violet is the artist. Daisy, she's the shy one. And Hyacinth? How do I describe Hyacinth? She's not shy, but she doesn't talk much. It's like she spends all her time living in her own head. I think I understand. Seattle will be a place Daisy wants to visit, because she loves all of us, but she won't want to move back here. Not even temporarily. She's happier in Montana, where she's Daisy, Eli's wife, soon-to-be mother. She's a person in her own right. Eli looked at the young woman beside him. She showed a lot of insight for a 14-year-old girl. Thank you. Iris shrugged. No thanks necessary. Just make my sister happy. She stood up and stretched. I'm going to head back to the house. You're welcome to sit out here, or come into the parlor where the family will be. Eli nodded, still thinking about her words. I'm going to sit out here a little longer. He looked around the garden. It was huge. It seemed to be laid out in little sections. He could see that each section had a different flower. Iris had called this her section. A grin crossed his lips as he saw the irises in bloom. Yes, each daughter had her own section of the garden. It wasn't long before Mary came out and joined him on the bench. He looked at his mother-in-law warily, wondering if she was going to insist he not sleep in a bed with Daisy in her home. She'd been so domineering in Montana, and he kept waiting for her to act the same now that they were in Seattle. Daisy seems very happy, Mary said. Eli nodded. I feel like we have a good life together. He wondered if he should mention his concerns about her pregnancy. I'm worried about how hard she works, though, especially now that she's expecting. I am too. Would you object to her seeing our family doctor while you're here in town? Not at all. I was hoping to set that up. He couldn't believe he was actually agreeing with his mother-in-law about something. He'd never expected that to happen. Mary smiled. Good. We'll see what he recommends. At the very least, I'm going to send one of her sisters back with you to do the hard work until the baby is born. Eli hadn't thought about that. One of her sisters? You'd let one of them go? He loved the idea of having someone there to help her. Of course, as long as I knew two would be together taking care of each other. I have no problem with that. She leaned back, glad to have found that her son-in-law went along with her thinking. It'll have to be Jasmine. The others are still in school. Eli made a face. Daisy wasn't exactly fond of Jasmine. Would the younger girl cause problems? He didn't care. If she would come and help with the heavier work on the ranch, then she was more than welcome. That sounds wonderful. Thank you. Daisy woke up to the sound of the bedroom door opening, and she rolled to her side and peered at Jasmine. Why would she wake her? Her voice was slurred as she asked, "Huh?" She rubbed her eyes. Jasmine sat on the edge of Daisy's bed and hugged her sister. I always thought you didn't like me as much as the others. Mama told me I'm going home with you. I'm so excited. Daisy blinked rapidly. Jasmine thinks she's going home with me? What? You are? What happened while I was sleeping? Is this one of Jasmine's tricks? I am. I liked Montana for the short time we were there, but more than that, I like knowing that I'm the sister you want to take back with you. Jasmine hugged Daisy again before rushing out of the room. Daisy sat with her back against the headboard and stared at the closed door. What had just happened? Daisy touched up her hair and went down the stairs to find Eli sitting with her younger sisters and her mother in the parlor. She took a seat beside Eli on the couch, her eyes going to his to see if he knew anything about what had happened upstairs. He kept his gaze averted. She looked at her mother, who was making some sort of list with Jasmine sitting beside her, while Hyacinth sat on the floor off to one side of the room, leaning against the wall dreamily, and Iris and Violet whispered to one another. I think 6 work dresses will be enough for you. Do you have a good apron? Mary asked Jasmine. The one I have is all stained with dirt from digging in the garden at the shelter. I probably need to make a new one. Mary nodded and made herself a note. Take the stained one with you. You'll want it for gardening in Montana. At those words, Daisy turned to Eli and whispered, Why does Jasmine think she's going home with us? He obviously knew what was going on and hadn't said anything. Eli shrugged and stared straight ahead, not saying anything as he suggested Jasmine make sure she had some warm winter clothes. Eli, I need you to tell me what's going on. Daisy couldn't believe he was ignoring her questions as if she hadn't asked. We'll talk later, he whispered back. Once, Daisy would have taken that for an answer, but now she grabbed Eli's hand and pulled him toward the door. We're going for a walk. She didn't wait for anyone to respond as she dragged her husband away from the others. Have a good time, Mary called as she watched her daughter drag her son-in-law from the room. Once they were outside, Daisy started walking briskly toward the park. I need to know what's going on here. Eli shrugged. Your mother and I had a talk while you were sleeping, and we both feel like it would be a good idea for you to have someone to help you out until the baby's born, and maybe a little after. And you chose Jasmine? What were you thinking? You can't possibly think I want her in my home for the next 6 months. Daisy couldn't believe he would even contemplate taking Jasmine home with them. Well, she's the only one of your sisters who has finished school, so your mother thought she was the smart choice. It's only for a year or so. A year? No, Jasmine cannot live with us for a year. I'd kill her if I had to be beside her every single day. It won't work. Daisy shook her head emphatically. Eli sighed. I don't know what else to do. The further along you are, the less I'm willing to even leave you in the house alone for any time. I'm sure I'm going to come home and find you having the baby on your own or hurt and on the floor and needing help. Daisy groaned. How many doctors and midwives do I need to see for you to believe that I'm healthy? Eli wouldn't look at her. I'm not going to fight with you over this, Daisy. I've talked to your mother, and we both agree. Jasmine is going to come home with us, and she's going to help you with the heavy work around the house. She'll be able to ride out to me if there are any problems. By that time they'd reached the park, and as they passed someone she'd gone to school with, Daisy nodded politely. Oh, it's good to see you, the other woman said as she eyed Eli interestedly. You're the flower who moved off somewhere, Dakota Territory? Grace had never been a particular friend, but Daisy was mortified that the other woman didn't remember her name even though they'd been in school together for 6 years. I moved to Montana. This is my husband, Eli. Daisy politely made the introductions. Eli, this is Grace. She and I went to school together. Grace smiled and extended her hand. It's so nice to meet you. Now that you've married one of the Flowers, you're like a citizen of Seattle. Eli shook the young woman's hand. It's nice to meet you. He watched her with surprise. She'd gone to school with Daisy and didn't even know her name? How long will the two of you be in town? Grace asked. Just a week. We got here this morning, and we'll leave next Wednesday. Is your mother throwing any big parties while you're here? Grace addressed this question to Daisy, although her eyes didn't leave Eli. Just for family, Daisy replied. And you wouldn't be invited even if it were for the whole town, she added silently. Eli removed his hand from Grace's. We're going to continue our walk. It was nice meeting you, Faith. He turned away from her and started to walk away. Grace looked at him in surprise. My name is Grace. So it is. My wife's name is Daisy. He took Daisy's hand and tucked it into his arm, and the two of them walked away. Daisy looked over her shoulder as soon as they were out of earshot and saw that Grace was still watching them with a confused expression. She let out a giggle. Did you really forget her name or did you do that on purpose? Eli shrugged. I can't believe she went to school with you and couldn't remember your name. How hard is Daisy to remember? So you did do it on purpose? Of course I did, and I'd do it again. She had no right to treat you like a nonentity. Eli was obviously very upset by the way Grace had acted as if she wasn't a person in her own right, but Daisy didn't think anything of it. I'm used to it, you know. All my life I've just been one of the Flowers. You're not that to me. To me, you're the amazing Daisy King. You're smart and loving and good. People need to get to know you and realize that you're a wonderful person in your own right, not just someone who's part of some garden of people. Daisy smiled and squeezed his arm where her hand rested on it. I really am used to it. You shouldn't have to be. He looked down at her and smiled. I can't lose you. Humor me and let your sister come home with us. She sighed. Any sister but Jasmine. Daisy thought for a moment about how Jasmine had pulled daisies out of her trunk for her wedding and how she'd looked when she'd told her she never knew she liked her as much as the others. She wasn't being fair. Jasmine deserved a second chance. Didn't everyone? Their week in Seattle flew by. Daisy was happy to be home, but she was more than ready to go back to Montana by the end of the week. The doctor in Seattle had said the same thing the doctor in Montana had said. She was young and healthy, and there was nothing to worry about. She could see that his opinion didn't help Eli in any way. Jasmine got more and more excited as the week went by. The day before they were supposed to leave, Daisy took a walk to Amaryllis's house to talk to her about the change in their sister. She seems like she actually wants to be my friend instead of my tormentor now. I'm not sure what to think. Amaryllis looked at Daisy as she sat on the couch nursing the baby. Do you trust her? Daisy could see by the look on Amaryllis's face that she didn't think Jasmine could be trusted. I don't know. I mean, she took a bouquet of daisies to Montana so I wouldn't have to be married without them. Amaryllis stared at Daisy in disbelief. Jasmine did? Without being told? Daisy nodded. I couldn't believe it either. She didn't even try to get me to pay her for them. She just gave them to me like she was thrilled to be able to do something nice for me. She looked down at her hands for a moment. It frightened me. Amaryllis burst out laughing. It's pretty sad that we are so suspicious of our sister that we're frightened when she does something nice. Daisy bit her lip, considering. It just usually means that she's planning something really mean, and we need to be extra careful. I haven't heard of her doing anything really evil lately. Maybe she's changing. Amaryllis said the word skeptically as if she didn't believe Jasmine was capable of that kind of change. Well, she said some really embarrassing things in Montana as well. It was like she was trying to decide if she wanted to be nice sister or demented nincompoop Jasmine as usual. Daisy shrugged. I don't seem to have a choice about her going back to Montana with me, though, so I'd better make the most of it. I'll pray for you, Amaryllis whispered so seriously they both burst into laughter. Daisy left a few minutes later with a promise to write. She wasn't sure how she felt about Jasmine going along. She'd seemed like she was a decent person a couple of times lately. Maybe she really was growing up. Chapter 7. Daisy slept a lot on the train back to Montana, leaving Jasmine and Eli to talk. Sometimes she would hear parts of their conversations, but that was okay. She was tired, and she just kept sleeping. What exactly am I going to need to do? Jasmine asked. Eli shrugged. Mainly, I just want you to help out with the heavy things. Go down to the cellar instead of letting Daisy do it. You be the one to get on your knees and scrub the floors and weed the garden. Don't let her lift anything. He studied Jasmine's face as he described what he wanted, hoping that she'd be willing. Jasmine nodded. I can help with the cooking too. I don't cook as well as Daisy, but I've been learning. I'm sure Daisy can help you get even better at it. She'll let you know what she needs. More than anything, I want someone to be there with her while I'm out on the range. I'm worried she's going to fall and not be able to get up, or start to bleed, and no one will know. I can do that. Jasmine stared out the window as the miles flew by. Daisy seemed so content lying with her head on Eli's shoulder. Someday Jasmine wanted to marry as well, but she wasn't sure she could with her reputation as a troublemaker. Not in Seattle anyway. Maybe there would be someone in Montana for her. They got back on Friday evening, and Daisy was surprised by how hard Jasmine was willing to work from the Saturday they arrived. She went to the cellar for her every time she opened the trapdoor. She was the one who weeded the garden while Daisy made lunch. Daisy had a lot more time to sit and sew for the baby than she'd expected, because her sister was being so helpful. Jasmine rushed in from weeding the garden and went into the bathroom to wipe the dirt from her face. That's fun. Daisy looked at Jasmine with surprise. What's fun? I like weeding. Mother's been trying to get me to help in the flower gardens forever, but I've always refused. Now I see why she does it. She really does enjoy it. Jasmine wrinkled her nose. I was skeptical that it was possible to enjoy that kind of labor. Daisy laughed. My vegetable garden is a far cry from Mama's flower gardens. Well, sure, because your garden is actually useful. You love jasmine. Well, yes, but I don't love all the other flowers. Mama should have just made a jasmine garden and forgotten about the rest of you. Jasmine's eyes sparkled with mischief. Daisy shook her head and sighed. Typical Jasmine. The laughter left Jasmine's face, and she looked down at her hands. I don't want to be typical Jasmine anymore. I want to be good. Like you. The earnest look on Jasmine's face told Daisy she was serious about what she was saying. What do you mean? Whenever Mama talks about us all, she says that you're the good one, and I'm the mischief maker. I'm tired of being the mischief maker. Daisy watched with shock as a tear drifted down her sister's cheek. Are you serious? Jasmine nodded. I want to be known for being good and sweet and kind. Not for all the pranks I play on my sisters, and everyone else I meet. Well, here you're starting fresh. No one will ever know that you were a prankster at home. Here you can just be Jasmine. She leaned down to peek into the oven and see if her bread was almost done. I love being able to be just Daisy. I'm not one of the flowers. I'm just me. I think that's what I need as well. I need to be around people who don't know all about my orneriness. People who haven't known me since I was in diapers. Daisy nodded. You'll definitely get that here. She pulled the bread out of the oven and set it on the work table to cool. Eli will be here any minute for supper. Would you mind setting the table? It was the first thing Daisy had actually asked Jasmine to do, and her sister jumped to get the dishes down. Daisy shook her head as she watched her. She was definitely going to have to write Amaryllis a letter about this. Sunday morning at church, Jasmine sat quietly beside Daisy. She looked around her at all the men. She was used to seeing a great deal more men than women, but this was even worse than Seattle. Here there seemed to be 6 men for every woman. After the service, there was a short line of men wanting to talk to her. She wasn't quite 18 yet, and knew her mother would have a fit if she let one of them court her, so she just talked to each one. After turning down 6 buggy rides, she looked at Daisy with wide eyes. Daisy just shrugged at her. She felt like she should warn everyone that Jasmine wasn't what she seemed, but she didn't. Jasmine had a right to start over as well. When she turned 18 in 2 months, things would be different, though. Eli put his hands on Daisy's shoulders, and she turned her face up to his. "She's doing better than I thought she would." Eli nodded. "Just give her a chance to find her place here." James went by the ranch house at least twice a week to see if there was anything Daisy needed help with. He knew that her sister was there, but he felt like he needed to offer anyway. He rarely came empty-handed. Sometimes he brought a bouquet of flowers that he'd picked on the ranch while working. Sometimes he'd just bring a pretty rock he'd seen. One day in late September, just over a month before Daisy was due, he brought a pretty maple leaf with red along the veins. He gave it to Daisy, and she accepted it happily. She was sitting in her rocking chair, working on a small quilt for the baby, while Jasmine fixed supper. Jasmine had been invaluable to her during her time in Montana, and Daisy knew that although she could have done it without her sister, it was much easier with her there. "Thank you." Daisy flipped the leaf over in her hand, watching James as he watched Jasmine. His visits had been a great deal more frequent since they'd brought Jasmine back from Seattle with them. "It's beautiful." James smiled. "It's the first one I've seen turning. You'll have to take your walk out toward the pasture if you want to see more." He had observed Daisy and Jasmine walking every afternoon when the weather was nice. "We will." "Is Eli working you hard?" James shrugged. "He always does. He's a hard taskmaster, but he needs to be." He stretched, rubbing his back. "He never asks for anything he's not willing to do himself, though." Daisy nodded. All the men she'd had a chance to talk to had told her the same thing. "Do you think we'll have an early winter?" James walked to the window and looked out. "I don't know. I'm going to make sure I don't get trapped out in it again." Jasmine turned from where she was chopping vegetables for a thick stew. "You got trapped out in the cold?" James looked at Daisy for a minute and shook his head before turning to Jasmine. "Your sister nursed me back to health when I was brought here half frozen." Jasmine looked at Daisy with surprise. "You never said anything." Daisy shrugged. "I don't know why I would say something. He was cold and I helped him. That's all. She spooned hot soup into my mouth and made me drink hot coffee until I was well enough to feed myself. Sat by my bed all night nursing me." James wasn't about to let Daisy downplay what she'd done for him. "I could see Iris doing that, but not you." Jasmine was obviously surprised to hear that her sister had helped the man. "I did what any Christian woman would do. He needed help and I helped him." "Why is that so surprising?" Jasmine shrugged. "I'm not sure exactly. I guess maybe it wasn't just the townspeople who just thought of you as one of the flowers." Daisy didn't say anything, but she knew it was true. Because she was quieter than her sisters and tended to keep to herself, many of them hadn't bothered to get to know her at all. Amaryllis was the only sister she had who she felt really knew her. James looked over at Jasmine. "Your sister wasn't the same back home?" Jasmine shook her head. "There are 8 girls in our family, and Daisy and I are right smack in the middle. Most of us have strong personalities, but Daisy, well, she was just Daisy. She was quiet where most of us were loud. She and Hyacinth were really the only quiet 2 in the bunch." "That doesn't sound like the woman I know." Jasmine made a face. "She's different here. I noticed it right away. I don't know if it's because she's married now, or because she's away from the rest of us. Maybe it's a little of both. It's a good thing, though. I love who she's become." James smiled as he headed for the door. "Well, I need to get back out on the range." I just wanted to bring you the pretty leaf. He tipped his hat to Daisy, but his eyes lingered on Jasmine. Daisy could see that he was interested in her sister. As soon as he was gone, Jasmine asked about him. He's always bringing you things. Daisy shrugged. I think Eli has asked him to check up on me. Different men come on different days. James comes on Monday and Thursday. I hadn't noticed they all had days. I thought they were just all coming to be nice. Usually you give them a snack. You didn't today. I didn't think about it. I should have. She sighed and rubbed her hand over her eyes. I'm sleepy. Jasmine looked at her with concern. Maybe we should skip our walk today, and you should just take a nap. You're sleeping for two now, Daisy laughed. You sound like Eli. He's always trying to push more food on me. You're eating for two. Or trying to get me to sleep late. You're sleeping for two. She rubbed the back of her neck tiredly. I'm walking for two as well, so we'll walk like we do every day. Thanks to Jasmine's help, all the vegetables from her garden were in and had been canned. The cellar was neatly organized with everything on shelves. No one had allowed Daisy to carry anything down to the cellar, but once she'd gone down on her own, she had put everything just where she wanted it. She was happy with their supplies and ready for the snows to fly. When Eli got home that afternoon, he saw the leaf. He picked it up with a smile. Did you find that on your afternoon walk? James brought it when he checked on us this morning, Daisy answered. She watched him as she said the other man had checked on her, wondering if he'd deny having anyone check on them. Really? Do the others bring gifts when they check on you, or do they just eat the food you two are always cooking? So you don't deny having the men check on me? Daisy asked, shaking her head. How many people did it take to watch over one pregnant woman? I wouldn't lie to you. Of course I have people checking up on you. There's a different man assigned to every day. Do they all bring gifts? Daisy shook her head. Only James. Eli frowned at that. I don't like men bringing my wife gifts. He brings me rocks and leaves. Don't be silly. She didn't mention then that she was certain the man was interested in Jasmine. She'd wait until they were alone for that, because she wasn't certain how her mother would react to Jasmine courting a cowboy. It was enough that she'd let Daisy marry a rancher. A cowboy, with no ranch of his own, might make her mother crazy. Eli said nothing more about it as he sat at the table and picked up his spoon. He prayed for the three of them, and they all ate in silence for a moment. Good stew. Jasmine smiled. Thank you. Eli looked at her with surprise. Did you make it without help this time? He knew Jasmine had been working on her cooking skills, but he hadn't realized she'd come that far. She did. Daisy responded. She's becoming an excellent cook. She watched her sister blush. I'm doing my best. Jasmine was obviously pleased with all the compliments to her cooking. Jasmine had gotten into the habit of sitting and talking with Daisy and Eli in the evenings while Daisy stitched. Occasionally, Jasmine would sew as well, but she really hated to sew. She preferred to sit and talk and didn't mind having idle hands one bit. They hadn't been raised to work every minute of the day. That evening while they sewed, Jasmine broached the subject of courting. If I were back in Seattle, Mama would be letting me court now. She said the words nervously as if she were leading up to something. Daisy exchanged looks with Eli. But only after Aunt Harriet had the man you were thinking of courting investigated. Eli looked between them. Investigated? How did I escape being investigated? Jasmine laughed. You didn't. You don't think someone came out here and made sure you were all right before Daisy came to marry you? Are you serious? It had never occurred to him that anyone had checked him out before Daisy could marry him. Daisy nodded. You remember meeting Higgins? He came out here and asked questions about you. Had she never mentioned that to him? She couldn't remember. Eli was stunned. What would have happened if I'd been deemed unacceptable by Higgins? Daisy and Jasmine exchanged glances. I wouldn't have been allowed to marry you. You saw how Mama was even with Higgins agreeing that you were fine. So you would have just given up on the idea of marrying me if I hadn't lived up to your mother's expectations? Daisy wasn't certain what the problem was. Well, I hadn't met you yet, so yes, I would have. If I'd met you first, I'm sure it would be a different story. Why didn't you tell me? His eyes flashed with anger. How could she have kept something like that from him? Daisy shrugged. I didn't deliberately keep it from you. It just never occurred to me that you would care. Of course I care. I hate the idea of someone prying into my past. Eli stood. I need to take a walk. Daisy got to her feet slowly, putting her hand on his arm. I'll go with you. She didn't feel up to a walk, but something was wrong, and she thought they should talk it out. He shook his head, obviously angry. I need to think, and there's no way you could keep up. She watched him as he stormed out the door and turned her attention to Jasmine. I guess I should have told him. Jasmine just nodded. Maybe so. She stared at the door for a moment and looked back at Daisy. Do you think I can start courting now that I'm 18? Daisy shook her head slowly. Not without Mama's approval. I'm sure Higgins will need to come out here once you decide who you want to be courted by. Jasmine made a face. I've already decided. Daisy closed her eyes. Please don't let it be James. Who's that? There's just a man at church that I think would be a good husband for me. He's asked me to go for buggy rides a few times, but I keep telling him I can't yet. How can I let him know I'm interested if I keep telling him no? Jasmine didn't want to have to explain that her mama and papa didn't want her to court anyone without their approval. Daisy thought about that for a moment. Well, what I would do is tell him that your parents are very particular about who courts you. You would love to get to know him better, but you've promised your mother that you'll have anyone who is interested investigated. Should I admit to having him investigated? Jasmine gestured to the chair Eli had just abandoned. Well, you don't want a scene like that when you're 8 months pregnant, do you? Daisy asked wryly. Jasmine laughed. Probably not. I'll talk to him on Sunday. By the time Eli got home that night, Daisy was already asleep. She'd tried to wait up, but the pregnancy was weighing heavily on her, and she just couldn't stay awake. She tossed and turned through the long night, knowing that Eli was angry with her. It was their first real fight, and it bothered her. He was cold but cordial the following morning. He ate his breakfast silently. What will you be doing today? Daisy asked. He shrugged. Working. She shook her head. Fine. She took a bite of the eggs Jasmine had made for them. I think we're going into town for more flour today. We're down to the bottom of the barrel, and we need to bake some bread. You're too far along to go into town without me, he argued, and I'm going to be too busy on the range today to play nursemaid to you and your sister. Daisy felt herself bristling at his words. No one is asking you to play nursemaid. She can't go without me, because she doesn't know how to shoot yet, and we need flour. Either let us go without you or assign someone to guard us. I don't care which. She stood and carried her plate to the scrap bin, scraping the food she hadn't eaten into it to feed to the chickens later. Don't take that attitude with me. Daisy set the plate into the sink and turned back to him, her face flushed with anger. I'm not your child to be ordered about. I'm your wife. If you don't want to go with me, then I'll go with just my sister, but I will be buying flour today. I'm an adult woman who is married, and I'm about to give birth. I will not be treated like a child ever again. Eli stalked across the room toward her, towering over his small wife. You will not be going to town unless I have time to ride with you. Daisy shook her head. Then you'd better give up on working today, because you're going to have to sit here and watch the house. You can't stop me otherwise. She poked him in the chest to emphasize her words. What happened to the sweet little girl I married? He bellowed, the anger vibrating off him. She grew up. Now help me, or get out of my way. I need to go to town today. She looked at Jasmine, who was seated at the table watching the exchange with wide eyes. We'll go after we finish the dishes. Jasmine nodded, not certain what to say, but she could see that her sister was not backing down. She wanted to cheer, but she didn't think either of them would appreciate it. Daisy turned to the basin and poured the hot water she'd been warming on the stove into it. She added a bit of soap and started scrubbing the dishes, rather than waiting for Jasmine. They'd formed a routine during the time Jasmine was there, and she usually washed the dishes while Daisy dried them. Daisy didn't really care that day. She just couldn't keep standing there and looking at her husband. Eli caught her arm and turned her toward him. He was angry enough that his chest was heaving. "Are you really going to defy me? You can bet the ranch on it." She jerked her arm away from him, not quite believing he was acting like that. What was his problem? "I have work to do, and if I remember correctly, you said you had too much work to do to go to town with us today, which must mean you have a lot of work. Get to it." She turned back around and resumed washing the dishes, ignoring him. He stalked to the door and plopped his hat onto his head before heading out. "You'd better keep your bottom on this ranch until I get home at noon for lunch." No, Daisy worked hard to keep her voice soft and controlled as she responded to him. She didn't want to fight with him, but she wasn't going to sit down and let him run all over her either. She was a woman, and women should have rights. She didn't care what men had to say about it. "No?" He stalked toward her. She wasn't backing down a single inch, and he couldn't believe this shrew was the woman he'd married less than a year before. Where was her willingness to please him? Her fear of doing anything wrong? No, she walked to the table and cleared off the last of the dishes, while Jasmine sat still watching the fight going on before her. She looked as if she were watching a sporting match, with the way her eyes moved from one face to the other. "I won't have you risking my child's life by running off to town whenever you get the whim." "Whim? I'm running off to town so that I can feed you. So that I can feed that child. If you don't like it, either go for me or come with me. I'm done with this discussion." She turned away from him and resumed washing the dishes, methodically and evenly. With the mood she was in, she wanted to throw the plates across the room, not wash them meticulously, but she knew they couldn't afford to spend money on new dishes just because she lost her temper with her hard-headed husband. He glared at her and left the house. Jasmine sat and stared at Daisy for a minute, wondering what on earth had just happened to her docile, agreeable sister. Eli stood outside for a moment, clenching and unclenching his fists, trying to force the anger to leave him. He couldn't deal with a headstrong woman in the middle of roundup. It was time to take the cattle to market, and she wouldn't listen to him about anything. Was she just using this as an excuse to leave him? Maybe she'd wanted to have an argument in front of Jasmine so that she could leave him without her family saying anything to her about abandoning her responsibilities. Yes, that was probably it. He'd come home at the end of the day, and she'd be gone using going to town for flour as her excuse. He stalked away from the house. If she left him, he'd just go get her and bring her back where she belonged. He wasn't going to cower away from the idea of her leaving any longer. She was his wife, and she'd stay his wife. As soon as they were done with the breakfast dishes, Jasmine went out to hitch up the wagon. It was one of the first things Eli had shown her how to do, so she and Daisy would be able to freely go into town and get supplies or go to visit neighbors. He didn't want Daisy doing it herself during her pregnancy, but she was perfectly capable as well. Jasmine helped Daisy into the wagon, because she was moving so slowly these days. Neither sister had said anything about the fight she'd had with Eli until they were driving toward town. "Do you want to tell me what happened this morning?" Jasmine asked, wondering if Daisy would open up to her and talk about the madness she'd witnessed. Daisy turned to Jasmine, sparks flying out of her eyes. "You mean, why did I turn into a crazed lunatic this morning when my husband acted like an idiot?" I guess that's one way to put it. Jasmine didn't want to make her sister any angrier than she was. She'd been around the 3 oldest sisters during their pregnancies, and they'd turned into crazy women one after the other. She was afraid of pregnant women. How she'd convinced herself Daisy would be different was beyond her. "He doesn't trust me, and it makes me furious." She pointed to the pistol she carried on her lap every time they went to town. "I'm perfectly capable of shooting while I'm pregnant, and I'm accurate. I could probably outshoot Lily at this point, But he thinks that I need to stay home and lock myself in the house so I don't break. The man would wrap me in cotton batting if I'd let him. Jasmine grinned. He only does it because he loves you so much. Daisy snorted. Love? Huh. He doesn't know the meaning of the word. She shook her head. That man wouldn't know love if it bit him on the neck. So, let me ask you this, how did you turn into Crazy Daisy so quickly? I've never seen you stand up to anyone that way. I thought you were going to kick him, you looked so mad. He makes me crazy. If I turned into Crazy Daisy, then it's all his fault. She sighed. I have a feeling we're going to have a nice repeat of that fight when he goes home for lunch and we're not there. Jasmine looked at Daisy. It won't take us that long in town. Why won't we be there at lunchtime? Because we're mad at him, that's why. We're going to shop, and then we're going to have a nice lunch in the hotel. I need to eat something that neither of us cooked for a change. Jasmine shrugged. I can go along with that. Daisy was still fuming when Jasmine had to help her down out of the wagon. This baby is going to be the death of me, she groaned, putting her hand to her back. I feel like I've been pregnant for 6 years. I think that's what Eli's afraid of, Jasmine mumbled. Daisy ignored her sister and walked across the street to the mercantile where she looked for the things she needed. She found some yarn to make a small cap and booties for the baby, and she purchased some fabric to make some sleepers. Then she got down to the business of buying food. She slammed everything she wanted on the counter, making the merchant eye her skeptically. You doing well today, Mrs. King? Feeling all right? Daisy turned her angry eyes on him. I feel like I'm 11 months pregnant with triplets. How do you think I feel? The merchant wisely didn't say another word as he carefully gathered what she needed from the list she'd handed him and placed everything on the counter. Daisy was startled as she felt a hand on her arm, and she turned, her eyes flashing with anger. When she saw it was Clara, she sagged and hugged the other woman tightly, crying on her shoulder. Clara had watched Daisy and the anger that accompanied her every movement. She knew something was wrong with her friend. Let's have lunch after we finish our shopping, she whispered as she patted Daisy's back. I don't have anyone with me except Natalie, and we'll have her and Jasmine eat together so we can talk. Daisy nodded as she stood and wiped the tears from her eyes. She felt like there was a tiny being inside her head, causing her to have crazy moods and do things that were unlike her normal self. I need that. Daisy meekly finished her shopping while Clara quickly hurried around the store and purchased what she needed. Daisy could see Natalie and Jasmine talking in a corner of the store. No doubt it was about how she'd turned into Crazy Daisy that morning. After she'd purchased everything, the merchant carefully loaded everything into the back of her wagon. She wandered over to Jasmine and Natalie. I'm going to have lunch with Clara. You two eat together, but don't sit close to us. I need to talk to my friend. Jasmine nodded warily. She wasn't about to do anything to rock the boat. Daisy's eyes were red-rimmed, and she had shouted at the owner of the mercantile. She knew better than to argue. Daisy and Clara sat in a corner of the restaurant, and Daisy poured her heart out, explaining how strangely Eli had been acting since she'd become pregnant. She hadn't really confided in Clara before, about everything that had led up to her moving to Montana, or about how she was feeling in her pregnancy. When she was finished, Clara sat back. First of all, you know that women tend to act strange when they're pregnant, right? Daisy shook her head. She had never heard anything like that. What do you mean? I don't think anyone really knows why, but women get really moody while they're expecting. I told Albert that I wanted to go home and live with my parents while I was carrying our youngest. My mother and I don't even like each other. Daisy looked at her friend with wide eyes. You didn't? Clara nodded. Oh, I did. Natalie looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and I felt as if I had. She paused to take a bite of her chicken. Do you feel like something is just washing over you, causing you to be angry, and then suddenly it feels like someone else is in control of your body? Daisy nodded. I do sometimes. I didn't this morning, though. I think I really meant everything I said to Eli. It sounds like he deserved every word. I'm glad you finally said it. Good for you. I wish he wasn't so overprotective. He's really making me crazy. I can't figure out if he's really that worried about the baby, or if he thinks I'm going to leave him. I get the impression that he thinks I'm going to leave him. Clara thought about that for a minute. Albert knows him much better than I do, of course, but I think that may be exactly what he's worried about. I know he was an orphan. I honestly think that Albert is the person he's known longer than any other. He said that Albert was really the only person who had ever been there for him. Daisy didn't feel she had the right to reveal anything other than what she already had. She didn't know if Eli wanted people to know about his early life. That's probably his problem then. He doesn't think anyone is willing to be in his life for any period of time. Clara shook her head sadly. You've got a long row to hoe with him. I know. Daisy sighed. I guess I need to go home and have a good long talk with him. I deliberately didn't go home for lunch, and I'm sure he expects me to be there. Clara hid a giggle behind her napkin. He won't be pleased, but I'm sure it's what he needs. I'm glad you don't think I'm a terrible person for making that decision, Daisy said. I was worried I was being too harsh on him. Too harsh? You've been a saint to put up with his nonsense for as long as you have. Clara took a sip of her coffee. You need to come over for supper tonight. You need to be around other people for a change. She gestured to where Jasmine and Natalie were sitting together, giggling at a table close to them. I think my daughter and your sister might end up being good friends anyway. Daisy looked over at Jasmine and smiled. Her sister had always had a hard time making friends, because of her reputation as a troublemaker. In school, she'd been the one sneaking snakes into the teacher's desk, not the boys. Daisy was happy that she was able to finally rise above her bad reputation. Daisy nodded. I think that's a great idea. I don't know that Jasmine has ever really had a friend that wasn't one of us. One of us? Her sisters. Clara frowned. She seems so sweet. Is she shy? Daisy laughed. Not at all. I'm the shy one. Jasmine is special. At Clara's questioning look, she shook her head. She won't be any trouble. I'm not going to gossip about my sister. That's fair. Clara paid for her meal and stood up. We need to get back to the ranch. We left Gertie with the little ones, because it was Natalie's turn to come into town. It's hard to bring all the young ones, so I let the girls take turns staying with them. They both like the chance to come to town. Daisy stood as well and noticed both girls had gotten to their feet when they saw Clara. What time do you want us at your house? She asked, rubbing her belly absently. Would 6 work? Does that give Eli enough time to finish for the day and give you time to get to our place? Daisy thought about it for a moment before nodding. I think so. We'll be there by 6:30 at the latest. Clara grabbed Daisy and pulled her into a tight hug. I look forward to it. Daisy looked at Jasmine, who came to join her. You ready to go back to the ranch? She asked. Jasmine nodded. It's laundry day. Time to get back to work. Daisy smiled, linking her arm with Jasmine's. Have I said thank you for all the help you've given me in the past few months? Jasmine eyed Daisy warily. Is that a trick question? If I answer, are you going to turn into crazy Daisy again? I think I have full control of my emotions again, Daisy replied. I'm so glad to hear it. I was getting worried about you. Eli walked into the house at noon and saw that it was empty. He immediately went out to the stable to see if the horses were there. When he saw they and the wagon were missing, he got back on his horse and headed to town. If Daisy and Jasmine had left right after breakfast, they had plenty of time to get back and see to lunch. Where were they? If she left me, I'm just going to drag her back. She's not leaving me, and she's not taking my baby away from me. I'll find her and she'll stay with me no matter what it takes, he mumbled as he rode toward town. He didn't have to go far. He found the 2 sisters driving toward him about halfway to town. He motioned for Jasmine to pull to the side of the road and he went to Daisy's side of the wagon. Where were you? He didn't add that he thought she'd left him, but she could see it in his eyes. I told you we were going to town for supplies. We ran into Clara and Natalie in town and had a nice lunch at the restaurant. We've been invited to their home for supper tonight, and I said yes. Jasmine and I will be leaving for their house no later than 5:15. I suggest you be in the wagon by then. Daisy turned back to Jasmine, who was watching her with wide eyes. Let's go. Eli watched as Jasmine drove away with his wife shaking his head. He'd heard women went a little wild when they were carrying, but this was the first time he'd really seen it with Daisy. They weren't alone until they were in bed that night, and Daisy presented him with her back immediately instead of settling down with her head on his shoulder as she usually did. He thought about letting it go for a moment, but then he decided they needed to talk things out. They didn't have enough time alone now that Jasmine was there, and this might be the only time they really had where they could talk privately. I won't let you leave me, he blurted out. He hadn't been meaning to start the conversation that way, but the words were out, and he couldn't pull them back no matter how much he wanted to. Daisy shifted her bulk in the bed until she was facing him. I have no intention of leaving you. Why would I leave the father of my child a month before he's born? Are you crazy? He looked at her in the darkness for a moment before saying in a soft voice, I thought that's where you were when I came home from working today. I thought you'd left me to go home to Seattle. Daisy shook her head at him and sighed. I can't go home to Seattle. Do you know why? He shrugged. Because it would be too embarrassing to admit you couldn't make it work. Not at all. I'm not that proud. Why then? Because Seattle's not home anymore. Montana is. How could I be home in a place where you're not? She reached out and rubbed his arm where it lay atop the quilt. I came here because I wanted to. I married you because I wanted to. Yes, I had you investigated by Higgins, but only because that was the only way my parents would allow me to come. I read your letter and was ready to leave that day. But you wouldn't have married me if it had been a negative report. Daisy shook her head. No, I wouldn't have. My parents wouldn't have allowed it. I was 18 when I married you. An 18-year-old woman has no freedoms unless her parents allow her to. Why do you think I could have jumped on a train to marry a stranger without my parents' permission? I guess I never really thought about it. I don't think you've thought about a lot of things. I love Montana, and I love being married to you. Why would I ever leave you? I don't know. His voice was soft in the darkness, and she could hear his apprehension. She knew that he cared for her, even though he had a hard time admitting it. It was there every time he helped her. It was there in the way he'd gone behind her back to arrange for Jasmine to come home with them. I'm never going to leave you. Daisy watched him, hoping he would react to her words. Everyone else has. As soon as the words were out of his mouth, Eli wished he could take them back. They were true, though. No one had ever stayed in his life for any period of time. No one loved him enough to stay with him. Well, I won't. Albert has been part of your life for how long now? Do you worry he'll leave? No, but that's different. We've been friends for years. And I'm going to be your wife for the rest of your life. I'm not going anywhere either. You need to start trusting that. He sighed. I'm trying to trust that. I've just never loved anyone the way I love you, so it's hard. Daisy stared at him in the darkness. You love me? Of course I love you. Why else would I be so worried that you were going to leave me? I wouldn't care if I didn't love you. He rubbed the back of his neck. I tried really hard not to love you, but I couldn't help myself. Why didn't you want to love me? Sometimes the man made no sense to her at all. I knew if I loved you, it would hurt more when you left. I'm not leaving. She wanted to scream, but knew there was no point. She'd just wake Jasmine and have to explain why she was making so much noise, and no one wanted that. I hope not. Daisy cupped his face in her hands. Listen to me, you crazy man. I love you. I've loved you since I first came to Montana. I'm not leaving you. He jerked in surprise. You do? Of course I do. Why else would you make me so crazy? Do you know Jasmine has started calling me Crazy Daisy? What kind of nickname is that? I've spent my whole life being calm and sweet, and I meet you and turn into a shrew. You make me crazed. But you love me anyway? Yes, of course I love you anyway. No one has ever said that to me before. His words were whispered as if he were half afraid to say them. Then you've never met anyone worth knowing. People should say they love each other. It's important. He pulled her closer. I'm glad you love me. Please don't leave me. I told you I'm not leaving you. I know you won't on purpose, but what if something happens with the baby? Then you'd leave me. What do you mean if something happens with the baby? Daisy felt like she understood him a little bit less with each minute that passed. What if you die? Daisy shook her head. I've had a healthy pregnancy. I'm going to be fine. 2 doctors and a midwife have all told you that I'm going to be fine. Can't you trust them even a little? He shook his head. No, I can't. I know you're going to leave me. I know you won't do it on purpose, so you'll do it when you have the baby. That makes no sense. I'm not going to leave you. We're going to be happy for the rest of our lives. I hope so. The closer Daisy got to her time, the more nervous Eli became. He went back to the house to check on her 3 and 4 times per day, making sure she hadn't gone into labor. The first snow fell in mid-October, and he was certain that was the night she'd deliver. But the snow melted away, and she was still pregnant. Daisy was more and more miserable by the day. Jasmine had taken over more of the housework, and Daisy sat and watched her, helping where she could. Her feet were swollen, and she hurt everywhere. It had gotten hard to sleep at night, and she took frequent naps during the day. For the first time, she was glad her sister was there to help her. She'd been happy with her companionship since she'd come, but now she really felt that she needed help with all the work to be done. When mid-November came, she was still pregnant and ready to scream. She tried to keep it hidden from Eli, and Jasmine got the brunt of her frustration. This baby had better come soon, or I'm going to scream. Jasmine hurried over to Daisy with a cup of water. Sip this. It calms you. I'm sick of water. I'm sick of this house. I need to get out of here, but I hate walking anywhere. My shoes don't fit anymore. Jasmine smiled as she looked at her sister. My feet are bigger than yours. Why don't you borrow a pair of my shoes, and we'll go for a short walk? Just around the house a few times. I don't want to just see the house. I want to go further. Jasmine headed toward the stairs. I'm going to get you a pair of my shoes, and we'll walk just as far as you want to walk, and not a step further. Daisy waved her away. Fine. A few minutes later, they wrapped shawls around themselves, and Daisy stepped outside for the first time in days. I'm so sick of that house that I'm ready to scream. Jasmine nodded. I know. She had been listening to her sister rant for days. Why didn't she remember her other sisters getting this bad while they were expecting? Daisy kicked at a rock. Your shoes are too big. My feet are swimming in them. At least they're roomy and comfortable. Daisy sighed as she heard Jasmine trying to placate her. I'm sorry I'm being crazy Daisy again. I'm just so tired. I never get enough sleep. The baby feels like it's going to rip me in two. Jasmine rubbed Daisy's shoulder. I wish there were something I could do to help. Oh, Jasmine. You've been the best sister to me. You've cooked and cleaned without any complaint. You said you wanted to be a good person when you first came here, and you've become that. You're not the demented nincompoop you used to be. Daisy knew if either of them was a demented nincompoop, it was her, and not her sister. A demented nincompoop? Did you really just call me a demented nincompoop? Daisy shrugged. Amaryllis and I called you that all the time. Well, when we weren't trying to get Aunt Harriet to agree to sending you off somewhere to be a mail-order bride. Jasmine stopped walking and stared at Daisy in surprise. You wanted me to be a mail-order bride? Only if it got you out of Seattle. We needed you out of our hair until we were happily married. Jasmine thought about that for a moment, looking a bit hurt. You know, I guess I really can't blame you for that. I said some pretty ridiculous things to Amaryllis about both Walter and Alex. Daisy nodded. You were awful. You're much better now. Jasmine started walking again. You know, I'm not sure how much I like the very blunt Daisy. I'm sorry. I know I'm terrible. Daisy sighed. This baby is making me crazy. It'll be here soon, and then it'll all be over. Yesterday would be nice, Daisy said. I can't wait to hold him in my arms, but more than that, I can't wait to feel like my body is mine again. She sighed. I make it sound like I hate being pregnant, and I don't. I'm just so sore and tired all the time. Jasmine nodded. I understand. They walked on for a few minutes without saying anything, with Daisy stopping periodically to catch her breath and rub her stomach. I keep getting a cramp in my side. I think we should head back. Jasmine eyed Daisy. A cramp in your side? The baby's not coming, is it? Daisy shook her head. I'm sure I'd know if the baby were coming. Jasmine didn't argue, but she watched her sister carefully as they walked back toward the house. She was stopping every 5 minutes to catch her breath and rub her stomach. Jasmine was pretty sure the baby was on its way, but she didn't want to alarm Daisy. When they reached the house, Jasmine suggested Daisy lie down. When Daisy didn't argue, and instead went to her room to do as her sister suggested, Jasmine rushed outside. Every morning for the past month, Eli had told Jasmine where he'd be working that day, so she could reach him if she needed to. She tried to remember where he'd said he'd be that day. James rode up to the house while she was squinting and trying to figure out where her brother-in-law was. She ran to the horse. You need to get Eli to come home. I think Daisy's going to have the baby. James turned his horse around, calling over his shoulder, I'll send him home and then ride to get the midwife. He spurred his horse on as he rode to find his boss and friend. Jasmine went back into the house and began boiling water. She wasn't certain why she was boiling it, but she'd read in books that was the right thing to do, so she did it. She heard a gasp come from Daisy and Eli's room, and she ran to check on her sister. Are you all right? Daisy nodded. I think my water just broke. She was soaked on the lower half of her body. Jasmine smiled. Let's get you into a nightgown. But we have to get Eli so he can't get the midwife. We can't have a baby with just the two of us. I already sent for Eli when I realized you were in labor. He should be here any minute. You knew? Why didn't you tell me? Daisy couldn't believe her sister would hide that from her. I didn't want you to worry any more than you needed to. Eli is going to worry enough for all of us. She helped Daisy slide the clean gown over her head. I'm boiling water, but I'm not sure why. Daisy laughed. Did you read about that in a book? Jasmine shrugged. Sometimes Amaryllis left them lying around the house. You're allowed to read books, you know, and not just because Amaryllis didn't pick up after herself. Daisy started to slow walk through the house. In the book she'd read about what to expect during labor, it had suggested that walking would speed things up. She didn't let herself worry while she walked, leaning on Jasmine's arm, because she knew that Eli was already in a panic knowing she was having the baby. When the door slammed open, he rushed inside and swept her off her feet. You can't walk around. You're having a baby. He carried her through the house and into the bedroom, depositing her back onto the bed. You need to stay there. Daisy propped herself on her elbows. Books say I should walk, so I'm going to walk. She moved her legs over the side of the bed and carefully got back to her feet. Don't get in my way. She glared at her husband, knowing he'd put her right back to bed if she let him get away with it. He grumbled but took Jasmine's place, letting her lean on him while she walked. They walked into the kitchen, around and around the table. She would pause every time a contraction came upon her, and then they would walk some more. You need to rest. I need to walk. It makes it go faster, and we both know you want this over and done with, so you can stop your worrying. Daisy wasn't about to listen to him when he told her to rest over and over. She was ready for the baby to come, and she was going to do everything she could to speed up his arrival. It seemed like hours before the midwife arrived. When she saw Daisy up and around, leaning on her big husband's arm, she smiled. "I'm glad to see you walking. That's the best thing to make the baby come faster." Daisy didn't say, "I told you so," to Eli, but it was all she could do to keep the words inside. Mary, the midwife, led her back to her room and had her lie down so she could check the progress of the baby. "How far apart are your pains?" Daisy shrugged. "A minute or two, I think." "Good. How long have you been having them?" "Jasmine will know. She noticed them before I did." Daisy still couldn't believe Jasmine had been so focused on her that she'd realized she was in labor before she had known it herself. Mary went to check with Jasmine and came back into the room. "All right. You're getting close. Do you feel like you can keep walking?" Daisy rolled to the side of the bed and carefully got back to her feet. "Yes, I can." She walked out to Eli and leaned on him as she resumed her walk. Mary took Jasmine into Daisy's room and the two of them prepared the bed for delivery. Jasmine wasn't going to be in the room with her, but she was going to be an important part of the delivery. They'd decided weeks before that it would be Jasmine's job to keep Eli from going insane. It wasn't long before Daisy was back in bed, and Jasmine was sitting with Eli telling him silly stories about things their sisters had done over the years. Eli was shaking when Mary finally came out of the bedroom he shared with Daisy. She was holding the baby and rushed to the basin to wash it. Eli rushed over to see the baby. "How's Daisy?" "She's fine. I still need to clean her up, but the baby needs to be washed." She looked at Jasmine. "Can you finish with the baby while I take care of your sister?" Jasmine looked at the tiny baby. She'd not been present when any of her sister's babies were born, and had been too young to remember Iris's birth. She nodded tentatively. "I think so. Just bathe her, it'll be fine." Mary waited until Jasmine's hands were gripping her new niece before rushing back into the room with Daisy and closing the door firmly behind her. Eli stood by and watched as Jasmine washed his new little girl. "I thought it would be a boy. I don't know what we're going to call her." Jasmine smiled. "I'm sure you and Daisy will come up with something. Just don't call her Ivy. Too silly." When Jasmine was finished, she carefully put on the diaper that she'd laid out for the baby and one of the little gowns Daisy had carefully stitched. She then carefully swaddled her in the quilt she and Daisy had pieced before taking her to Eli. "Do you want to hold her?" Eli shook his head, holding his hands in front of him and backing up. "I'd break her." "No, you won't. Sit down." Jasmine waited while Eli sat, before placing his daughter into his arms. "She's beautiful, Papa." Eli stared down at the tiny baby. Her hair was dark, like her mother's, and he wished he could see what color her eyes were. "She's so small." Jasmine smiled down at them. "I'm going to go and see if Mary needs my help." She knocked on the door and carefully slipped inside. Mary was just finishing up. She'd helped Daisy into a fresh gown, and had left a small pile of linens in the corner of the room. "Where do you want those?" she asked Jasmine, assuming she'd be the one to do the laundry. "That's fine. I'll take care of them." Jasmine looked at her sister, who was sitting up in bed. "She's beautiful, Daisy." Daisy smiled. "I only got to see her for a second." "Did you put her in her cradle?" "Eli is holding her, trying to figure out what to name her. I told him that Ivy is not an acceptable name. No flower or plant names for us. I hadn't really thought about a girl name. I guess Eli and I will need to talk." Mary smiled. "I'll check in on you tomorrow and make sure you're doing all right." She smiled down at Daisy. "You did very well for a first-time mother." Daisy sighed. "I didn't feel like I did well." Her eyes kept going to the door, wondering when Eli was going to bring the baby to her. Mary slipped out to send Eli in. "Everyone is fine. I'll be back tomorrow to check on both of them." Eli tore his eyes away from the baby. "Can I see her now?" "Of course. She's waiting for you." Eli stood, his arms cradling the baby carefully. Thank you. He rushed off, leaving her to find her own way out. When Eli entered the room, Jasmine discreetly left, leaving the new family alone while she fixed a quick supper for them all. Eli sat on the bed beside Daisy, leaning over and kissing her over the baby. She's so beautiful. Daisy smiled. She is. She held her arms out, and Eli placed the baby into them, and they both sat staring at her for a moment. What are we going to name her? Eli shook his head. No flower names, Jasmine said. No. No flower or plant names. She couldn't think of any names, though. Nothing was coming to mind at all. Maybe Dinah? I've always liked that name. Daisy thought about it for a moment before nodding. Dinah. I like it. Eli reached out and touched Daisy's cheek. Thank you for not dying. I don't know what I'd have done without you. Daisy laughed softly. Of all the things I thought my husband would say to me after I had our first child, thank you for not dying, was not one of them. He sighed. I don't know a lot of flowery words. I'm a simple man, I don't need flowery words. I just need the man I love. Epilogue. Daisy looked between her mother and her Aunt Harriet. I can't believe you two traveled all this way without any of the children. Harriet laughed. I have a good nanny, and Max is home with them. She was holding her new great-niece and smiled happily. She's a beauty. Thank you. Daisy was surprised her aunt had been able to wrestle the baby out of her mother's arms without stabbing her in the eye. Mary didn't tend to let her grandchildren out of her sight. Has Jasmine talked to you yet? Harriet's eyes met Daisy's. Has she met someone? Here? Daisy nodded. She wanted to start courting in September, but I told her she'd have to wait until she talked to you. I have no idea who it is, though. Mary frowned. I don't want another one of my daughters to move to Montana forever. Jasmine was just coming out here temporarily. I don't know what to tell you. She did meet someone, though. Harriet smiled. I'll talk to her. I've been trying to figure out how I'd find someone in Seattle to marry her. Her reputation for mischief is too strong. She's changed. I actually like her for the first time in our lives. I can see she has. She's fixed meals for us and acted like a good hostess. I hope whomever she has in mind will work out. Even Jasmine deserves happiness. Daisy smiled. Especially Jasmine,